She stood on that frozen platform, watching the last passenger disappear into the Dakota wind, and felt her entire future crumble into dust. 2 years of letters, 2 years of promises, 2 years of believing Thomas Hale would be waiting with open arms and a wedding ring. But the platform was empty, and the truth hit harder than the icy gust tearing through her Boston coat. He wasn't coming. She was stranded, 1,500 miles from home, with nothing but a trunk full of dreams and a heart that had just learned what betrayal tasted like. Stay with me until the end of this story, and comment below what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale travels. The wind howled across Redstone Station like a living thing, hungry and merciless, as Elise Warren pressed her gloved hands against her coat and tried to stop shaking. It wasn't just the cold. It was the awful, crushing realization that settled into her bones as she watched the last passenger, an elderly man with a crooked cane, shuffle past her toward a waiting wagon. The platform was empty now, completely, devastatingly empty. Elise's breath came in short, visible puffs as she stood beside her trunk, her eyes scanning the dirt road that led into town, searching for any sign of movement. Any sign of him. Thomas Hale. Her fiancé. The man who had written her 73 letters over 2 years, each one more convincing than the last, each one painting a picture of their life together in Dakota territory. A life that was supposed to begin today, at exactly 3 o'clock, on this very platform. She pulled the latest letter from her coat pocket with trembling fingers, unfolding it for what must have been the 100th time since she'd left Boston 3 days ago. My dearest Elise, I count the hours until you arrive. I'll be waiting at the station at 3 o'clock sharp, and the moment I see you step off that train, our forever begins. Your devoted Thomas. Devoted. The word tasted like ash now. Elise looked up at the station clock. 3:45. The train had been precisely on time. She had been standing here, waiting, watching, hoping, for 45 agonizing minutes. He wasn't coming. The station master, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained whiskers, poked his head out from the office door. "Miss, you all right out there? Storm's rolling in fast. You got somewhere to be?" Elise tried to form words, but her throat had closed up tight. She managed a small shake of her head. The station master's expression shifted from mild concern to something closer to pity. "You waiting on someone specific?" "Thomas Hale," she finally managed, her voice barely audible over the wind. "He was supposed to meet me. We're engaged to be married." The station master's face went carefully blank, that particular kind of blank that meant he knew something he didn't want to say. He stepped out onto the platform, closing the door behind him, and approached her with the cautious gait of a man delivering bad news. "Thomas Hale, you say?" "Yes. Do you know him? Has he sent word? Perhaps he's been delayed." "Miss," the station master cut her off gently, removing his cap and worrying it between his hands. "I know Thomas Hale. Known him about 6 months now, since he started coming through regular-like on the cattle runs." Hope flared in Elise's chest. "Then you must know where I can find him. If you could just point me toward—" "Miss, I'm going to be straight with you because you seem like a decent woman, and decent women shouldn't be left standing in the cold with false hope." He cleared his throat. "Thomas Hale is courting Mary Sullivan. Has been for the better part of 4 months. I saw them together just last week at the Founders' Day social. They were, well, they looked awful cozy, if you catch my meaning." The world tilted. Elise heard the words, understood them individually, but couldn't make them fit together into a truth her mind would accept. That's not possible. We've been corresponding for 2 years. He asked me to come here, to marry him. He sent money for the train fare. He sent you money?" The station master's expression darkened. "When?" 8 months ago, for the ticket." Something like anger flashed across the older man's face. "And he's been courting Mary for 4 months. Son of a—" He caught himself, swallowing the curse. "Forgive me, miss, but it seems you've been dealt a real dirty hand." The trunk beside Elise suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Everything she owned in the world was inside it. She'd sold her mother's china to afford the things she couldn't fit. She'd quit her position at the Boston Ladies' Seminary. She'd said goodbye to her sister, her friends, the only life she'd ever known. For a lie. for a man who had been courting someone else while writing her love letters. What am I supposed to do? The words came out as a whisper. She hadn't meant to say them aloud. The station master looked genuinely distressed. You got family back east? Money for a return ticket? Elise shook her head mutely. She'd spent the last of her savings on practical supplies for frontier life, things that now seemed absurdly useless. Heavy skillets, yards of sturdy fabric, seeds for a garden she'd never plant. The boarding house in town might have a room, the station master offered, though his tone suggested he didn't hold much hope. Mrs. Pritchard runs a clean establishment. Course, you'd need to pay, and work don't come easy for unmarried women in Deadstone. Most of the respectable positions are already filled. Deadstone. Even the name of the town sounded like a grave marker. There's always the Silver Spur, he continued reluctantly. They're usually looking for girls to work the bar, but I wouldn't recommend— No. Elise's voice came out sharper than she intended. She knew what kind of work that meant, and she hadn't traveled 1,500 miles to end up in a saloon. No, thank you. The station master nodded, looking relieved. Smart girl. Listen, I gotta close up here in a few minutes, but you're welcome to wait inside where it's warm until you figure out your next step. Storm's going to be a bad one. I can smell it in the air. As if to emphasize his point, the wind picked up, sending a spray of ice crystals across the platform. Elise's thin Boston coat, perfectly adequate for New England springs, offered about as much protection as tissue paper against the Dakota wind. Thank you, she managed, though the words felt hollow. What was she thanking him for? The truth that had shattered her dreams? The offer of a few more minutes of warmth before she had to face an impossible situation? The station master tipped his cap and headed back toward his office, leaving Elise alone on the platform once more. She stared down at the letter still clutched in her hand. Your devoted Thomas. How many hours had she spent reading these letters, treasuring every word, believing in the life they described? How many times had she traced his signature, imagining the hand that wrote it holding hers? It had all been a fiction, a story he'd told to— What? Amuse himself? Keep his options open? She couldn't even begin to understand the mind of a man who would do such a thing. The sound of wagon wheels on frozen ground made her look up sharply, hope and dread warring in her chest. But it wasn't Thomas. Instead, a tall man in a heavy coat and wide-brimmed hat was guiding a sturdy wagon toward the station. He pulled the horses to a stop near the platform and jumped down with the easy grace of someone who'd spent his entire life in motion. He was probably in his early 30s, with dark hair that curled slightly beneath his hat and eyes that were such a clear, startling blue that Elise could see their color even from several feet away. His face was weathered in the way of men who worked outdoors, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though he wasn't smiling now. He was looking at her with an expression of curiosity mixed with concern. Afternoon, he said, his voice a low rumble that somehow carried clearly despite the wind. You waiting for the next train? There isn't another train until Thursday, Elise replied automatically, then immediately wished she'd said nothing. The last thing she needed was conversation with a stranger while her entire world was falling apart. Thursday, the man repeated, glancing at the darkening sky. That's 3 days from now. You got somewhere to stay until then? The question was casual, but something in his steady gaze suggested he already knew the answer. Elise lifted her chin, summoning the last shreds of her dignity. I'm managing, thank you. Are you now? He tilted his head slightly, and those blue eyes swept over her, not in the leering way that made her skin crawl, but with the assessing gaze of someone reading a difficult situation. Because from where I'm standing, you look like someone who just watched their whole future walk away without them. The accuracy of the observation stole Elise's breath. For a moment she could only stare at him, the stranger who had somehow seen straight through her careful composure to the devastation beneath. I don't mean to be forward, he continued, his voice gentling, but I've seen that look before. Usually on faces at the poker table when a man realizes his hand isn't what he thought it was. Except you're not at a poker table, you're on a train platform in March, and that storm coming in isn't going to wait for you to figure out your next move. I appreciate your concern, Elise said stiffly, but I assure you— Let me guess. He held up a hand, cutting her off. Mail order bride? Fiancé who didn't show? The bluntness of it made her flinch. How did you? Happens more often than you'd think. Some men get cold feet, some men are running games, and some men... His jaw tightened. Well, some men aren't worth the paper they write their promises on. Elise felt something crack inside her chest. It was one thing to know she'd been abandoned. It was another thing entirely to hear a stranger name it so plainly, to know that her humiliation was so obvious, so common, that it could be spotted from across a train platform. "I need to go," she said abruptly, reaching for her trunk. It was absurdly heavy, and she'd only managed to drag it a few inches before the man was beside her, lifting it as though it weighed nothing. "Where are you taking this?" he asked. "I don't know," Elise admitted, hating how small her voice sounded. "The station master mentioned a boarding house." "Mrs. Pritchard's place?" The man shook his head. "She's full up. Circuit preacher came through last week with his whole family. Won't have space again until they move on, and that won't be until after Easter." Elise felt the last of her composure begin to crumble. "Then I'll find somewhere else." "In Deadstone?" The man's expression was sympathetic but realistic. "Miss, I don't want to be the bearer of more bad news, but this isn't Boston or Philadelphia. This is a cow town with one hotel that's more saloon than lodging, a boarding house that's full, and about a dozen families who might take you in, if you know them. Which I'm guessing you don't." "No," Elise whispered. "I don't know anyone." "You know me now." The man set her trunk down and extended his hand. "Colt Maddox. I run the Maddox Creek Ranch about 8 miles north of here." Elise stared at his outstretched hand. Every lesson she'd ever learned about propriety, about the dangers of trusting strange men, about maintaining respectability, screamed at her not to take it. But what choice did she have? What respectability was left to maintain when she was stranded, penniless, and abandoned? Slowly, she placed her hand in his. His grip was warm and calloused and surprisingly gentle. "Elise Warren." "Miss Warren." Colt Maddox tipped his hat. "Looks like someone left you standing in the wrong story." The metaphor was so apt, so perfectly devastating, that Elise felt tears prick her eyes for the first time since she'd stepped off the train. She blinked them back furiously. "I suppose they did?" "Well then." Colt's voice was steady, certain, as though he made life-altering decisions on train platforms every day. "You're free to come with me." Elise's breath caught. "I beg your pardon?" "I've got a housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, who manages the ranch house. She's been after me for months to hire help with the spring work. You can stay in one of the spare rooms, earn your keep, and figure out what comes next. No strings, no expectations, just honest work for honest pay." It was the most improper offer Elise had ever received. To go home with a strange man, to live under his roof, to work in his house, everything about it violated every social code she'd been raised to follow. But those codes belonged to Boston, to a world of tea parties and calling cards and carefully chaperoned courtships. That world had evaporated the moment Thomas Hale had failed to appear. This was Dakota territory, where survival mattered more than propriety. "Why would you help me?" Elise asked, because she needed to know. Needed to understand what this stranger's angle was. Colt considered the question seriously. "Because I've been where you are. Not exactly the same circumstances, but I've had the ground drop out from under me. I felt what it's like when everything you counted on turns to smoke, and someone helped me when I needed it. I figure I owe that kindness forward." There was truth in his voice, in the steady way he met her eyes. He wasn't offering rescue. He was offering work, a chance to earn her own way. It wasn't charity, and it wasn't a trap. It was simply an option where none had existed before. "What about my reputation?" The question sounded absurd even as she asked it, but old habits died hard. "Mrs. Chen is a dragon when it comes to propriety," Colt said with a slight smile. "You'll be more chaperoned at my ranch than you would be at Mrs. Pritchard's boarding house. I promise you that. And if you decide to leave, I'll pay your way to wherever you want to go. You have my word on that." Elise looked at the darkening sky, at the ice already forming on the platform rails, at the letter still crumpled in her other hand. She thought about Thomas Hale, somewhere in Deadstone, courting Mary Sullivan while Elise froze on a train platform he'd promised to meet her at. She thought about her sister in Boston, who had begged her not to come west, who had called her a fool for trusting a man she'd never met. She thought about the future she'd imagined, the house Thomas had described, the garden she'd planned, the children she'd daydreamed about, all of it dissolving like sugar in rain. And then she looked at Colt Maddox, this stranger who had seen her at her lowest and offered not pity, but possibility. "All right," Elise heard herself say. "I'll come." Something like relief crossed Colt's face. "Good. Let's get you out of this wind before you freeze solid." He hoisted her trunk into the wagon bed with one smooth motion, then turned back to offer his hand. "Storm's going to hit hard. We need to move." Elise let him help her up onto the wagon seat, her frozen fingers fumbling with her skirts. The moment she was settled, Colt was beside her, snapping the reins and guiding the horses away from the platform. As the wagon rolled forward, Elise turned back for one last look at Redstone Station, the place where her planned life had ended and something unknown had begun. The station master stood in the doorway of his office, watching them go with an expression Elise couldn't quite read. "He seems worried," she observed. "He's a good man," Colt said, "probably wondering if he should have done more to help you. But there wasn't much he could do. Deadstone isn't exactly overflowing with options for stranded women." "And you are? An option, I mean?" Colt glanced at her, and for the first time she saw something like humor in his expression. "I'm an option. Whether I'm a good one, well, I suppose you'll have to decide that for yourself." They rode in silence for several minutes, the wagon creaking beneath them, the horses' hooves steady on the frozen road. The landscape around them was vast and alien to Elise's eyes, endless stretches of brown grass, bare cottonwood trees, and sky that seemed to go on forever. It was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way that made Boston's tidy streets seem impossibly far away. "Can I ask you something?" Colt's voice broke the silence. "I suppose." "The man who left you standing there, Thomas Hale. Did you love him?" The question was invasive, inappropriate, and yet somehow Elise found herself answering honestly. "I loved the man in the letters, but I'm starting to think that man never existed." Colt nodded slowly. "That's the thing about words on paper. They can paint any picture the writer wants. Reality has a harder time lying." "Are you always this philosophical?" "Only when I'm trying to distract someone from the fact that we're about to drive straight into a blizzard." He pointed toward the horizon, where dark clouds were rolling in with alarming speed, swallowing the sky. "That storm I mentioned? It's here." As if on cue, the first fat snowflakes began to fall, quickly thickening into a wall of white. The wind picked up, howling across the prairie with renewed fury, and Elise clutched the wagon seat as the world around them disappeared into swirling snow. "How far to your ranch?" she shouted over the wind. "Too far to make it before this hits full force," Colt called back, his hands tight on the reins as the horses whinnied nervously. "There's a line shack about 2 miles ahead. We'll shelter there until it passes." "A line shack?" "Small cabin. Cowboys use them during calving season. Basic, but it'll keep us alive." The casual way he said, "keep us alive," sent a chill down Elise's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. This wasn't a Boston snowstorm, easily weathered with a warm fire and a good book. This was a Dakota blizzard, the kind she'd read about in newspaper accounts of settlers who had frozen to death mere yards from their own homes. The wagon lurched suddenly, one wheel hitting a hidden rut in the road. Elise grabbed for the seat, but the momentum threw her sideways. She felt herself falling, saw the ground rushing up. Colt's arm shot out, catching her around the waist and hauling her back against him. "Hold on!" he ordered, and Elise grabbed onto his coat with both hands as the wagon shuddered and tilted. For several terrifying seconds, she was certain they were going to flip, but Colt fought the reins with the skill of someone who'd handled far worse than a rutted road in a snowstorm, and slowly, agonizingly, the wagon righted itself. "You all right?" Colt's voice was close to her ear, his arm still tight around her waist. Elise nodded, not trusting her voice. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. "The road's too dangerous," Colt said grimly. "We're going to have to abandon the wagon and ride the rest of the way. Can you ride?" I've ridden. In Boston. In parks. Always mad some chartier." It sounded pathetic even to her own ears. Gentle rides on well-groomed paths bore no resemblance to riding through a blizzard on the open prairie. "That'll have to do." Colt was already moving, securing the wagon's brake and jumping down. He reached up for Elise. "Come on, we don't have much time." Elise let him lift her down, her legs nearly buckling when her feet hit the ground. The wind was so strong she could barely stand upright. Colt kept one hand on her arm as he quickly unhitched one of the horses, a large chestnut mare who seemed remarkably calm despite the chaos around them. "This is Rosie," Colt said, running his hand along the horse's neck. "She's steady. She'll get us there." He swung up onto the horse's bare back with easy grace, then extended his hand down to Elise. "You're going to have to ride with me. Can you do that?" Under any other circumstances, the impropriety of it would have made Elise refuse. But propriety meant nothing when the alternative was freezing to death on a Dakota road. She took Colt's hand and let him pull her up behind him, her arms wrapping instinctively around his waist as the horse shifted beneath them. "Hold tight," Colt said, and then they were moving, plunging into the white wall of the storm. Elise buried her face against Colt's back, feeling the solid warmth of him through his coat, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, even as the world around them turned into howling chaos. She couldn't see anything beyond the wall of snow, couldn't hear anything but the wind. She had no idea how Colt knew where he was going, how he could possibly navigate in this blinding white nightmare. But he rode with absolute certainty, guiding Rosie through the storm as though he could see a path invisible to everyone else. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Elise's fingers went numb where they gripped Colt's coat. Her face burned with cold despite being pressed against his back. Just when she thought she couldn't hold on anymore, couldn't bear another second of the freezing wind, Colt's voice cut through the storm. "There! I see it!" Elise lifted her head just enough to see a dark shape emerging from the white, a small wooden structure, barely more than a shed, but in that moment, it looked like salvation. Colt guided Rosie right up to the door, then slid down and reached for Elise. "Can you stand?" Elise tried, but her legs had gone completely numb. She stumbled, and Colt caught her, sweeping her up into his arms without hesitation. "My trunk," Elise started. "It's secure in the wagon. We'll get it once the storm passes. Right now, we need to get you inside before you lose any toes." He kicked the door open and carried her into the dark interior of the line shack. The silence after the howling wind was almost shocking. Colt set Elise down on something that felt like a rough wooden bench, then immediately turned to secure the door behind them. "Can you feel your fingers and toes?" he asked, already moving around the small space with practiced efficiency. "No," Elise admitted, and was alarmed to hear her voice shaking. "That's all right. We'll fix that." The sound of a match striking, and then a small flame bloomed in the darkness. Colt lit an oil lamp, and warm light filled the tiny cabin. The line shack was exactly as basic as Colt had promised. One room, maybe 10 feet square, with a potbelly stove in the corner, a narrow bunk against one wall, a small table, and 2 chairs. But it was dry, and as Colt got a fire started in the stove, it was beginning to warm. Elise watched him work, watched the efficient way he coaxed the kindling to catch, the care he took to make sure the stove was drawing properly. When he was satisfied with the fire, he turned his attention back to her. "Let me see your hands." Elise held them out, and Colt knelt in front of her, taking her frozen fingers in his. His hands were warm. How were they still warm? And he began to rub her fingers gently, methodically, bringing feeling back into them. It hurt. The returning circulation sent pins and needles shooting through her hands, and Elise gasped. "I know," Colt said quietly, "but it's better than the alternative. Keep breathing through it." Gradually, agonizingly, the feeling returned. When Colt was satisfied with her hands, he moved to her feet. "I'm going to need to remove your boots. Is that all right?" The question was so absurdly proper given their circumstances that Elise almost laughed. They were alone in a tiny cabin in the middle of a blizzard, and he was asking permission to remove her boots. "Yes," she managed. "Please." Her boots were soaked through, and her stockings beneath them weren't much better. Colt worked carefully, easing the tight leather off her swollen feet. When he saw her stockings, he frowned. "These need to come off too. They'll make the frostbite worse if you keep them on." Elise felt her cheeks burn, but she nodded. Modesty was a luxury she couldn't afford. She reached down to roll her stockings off, but her fingers were still too clumsy. Colt caught her wrist gently. "Let me," he said. and there was nothing but practical concern in his voice as he carefully, impersonally, removed her wet stockings and set them near the stove to dry. Then he wrapped her bare feet in a spare blanket from the bunk and began the same gentle massage he'd done with her hands, bringing circulation back to her frozen toes. Elise bit her lip against the pain, focusing on the top of his dark head bent over her feet, the surprising gentleness of his calloused hands. "You do this often?" she asked, partly to distract herself from the pain. "Rescue stranded women in blizzards?" Colt looked up, and she was startled to see humor in his eyes. "You're my first stranded woman. I've rescued plenty of cattle, a few horses, and once a very stubborn goat, but you're definitely my first person. How am I measuring up to the goat?" "You complain less." The corner of his mouth twitched, though the goat didn't get frostbite on her toes. Despite everything, the abandoned platform, the destroyed future, the frozen toes, Elise felt a laugh bubble up in her chest. It came out slightly hysterical, but it was real. "I can't believe I'm comparing myself to a goat." "A very accomplished goat," Colt said seriously. "She went on to have 6 kids and lived to the ripe old age of 14. Set a high bar, really." This time Elise's laugh was genuine, and Colt smiled, a real smile that transformed his weathered face and made his blue eyes crinkle at the corners. In that moment, sitting in a tiny cabin with a stranger while a blizzard raged outside, Elise felt something shift inside her chest. Not attraction, exactly, though Colt Maddox was undeniably handsome. It was something more fundamental than that. It was the feeling of being safe. For the first time since she'd stepped off that train, she didn't feel completely, devastatingly alone. "There," Colt said, giving her feet one final gentle squeeze before carefully wrapping them in the blanket. "Feeling should be back now. Might ache for a bit, but you'll keep all your toes." "Thank you," Elise said, and the words carried more weight than simple gratitude for warming her feet. "Thank you for seeing me on that platform. Thank you for offering help instead of pity. Thank you for treating me like a person instead of a problem." Colt seemed to understand. He nodded once, then stood and moved to check on Rosie, who he'd brought just inside the door, out of the worst of the wind. The horse whickered softly, and Colt ran a hand down her neck. "Good girl. Knew you'd get us here." Outside, the blizzard howled like a living thing, battering the walls of the little cabin. Inside, the fire crackled, and warmth slowly filled the small space. Colt found a battered coffee pot and some grounds in the cabin's small supply cupboard. "Coffee?" he offered. "Please." As Colt prepared the coffee, Elise let herself really look at him for the first time since she'd climbed onto his wagon. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of years of practice, each gesture precise and purposeful. His coat had come off, revealing a worn chambray shirt and suspenders. His dark hair was longer than was fashionable in Boston, curling slightly at his collar. He was, she realized, nothing like Thomas Hale had described himself in his letters. Thomas had painted himself as a refined gentleman farmer, someone who wore suits and attended society functions, who just happened to live out west instead of back east. But Colt Maddox was purely, unmistakably Western, a cowboy to his bones, practical and unpolished and utterly real. "How long have you had your ranch?" Elise asked. "Built it from nothing 8 years ago. Came out here with a horse, a rifle, and about $40 to my name." Colt poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed one to Elise. "First winter, I lived in something not much bigger than this line shack. Thought I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. What changed your mind?" "Spring came." Colt's voice was simple, but there was depth beneath it. "Watched the prairie turn green, saw the first calves born, realized I'd built something that was mine. Not something inherited or borrowed, mine. Built with my own hands, my own choices. After that, there was no going back east." Elise wrapped her hands around the warm tin cup, letting the heat seep into her still cold fingers. "Do you ever regret it? Every hard winter, every drought, every time a cattle deal falls through." Colt took a sip of his coffee. "But regret and reality aren't the same thing. This is my life, for better or worse. I chose it, and it chose me back." The words resonated in Elise's chest. She thought about her own choices, leaving Boston, trusting Thomas, stepping onto that train. Had those been choices, or just desperate grasps at a future she couldn't quite imagine? I didn't choose this, she said quietly, standing on that platform, watching him not show up. I didn't choose any of this. No, Colt agreed. You didn't, but you chose to get in my wagon. That was a choice. And whatever comes next, that'll be a choice too. It was a generous way to frame abandonment and desperation, but Elise appreciated it anyway. She sipped her coffee. It was strong and bitter and perfect, and let the silence settle between them. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but inside the line shack, there was only warmth and quiet, and the strange, unexpected comfort of sitting across from a man who had saved her life and asked for nothing in return. Tell me about Mrs. Chen, Elise said eventually. Your housekeeper. Colt's face softened. She's formidable. Came to Dakota 20 years ago with her husband during the railroad boom. He died of fever 5 years back, and she needed work. I needed someone to keep me from living like a complete savage. It's worked out well for both of us. She won't mind? A strange woman showing up to work in the house? She'll probably be thrilled. Mrs. Chen's been after me for months to hire help, especially with spring coming. Between the garden, the preserving, the cooking for the ranch hands during busy season, it's more work than one person should handle. I can do those things, Elise said, feeling a flicker of hope. I managed my sister's household for 3 years. I know how to cook, clean, preserve food. I'm not afraid of hard work. I didn't figure you were. Colt met her eyes. Women who are afraid of hard work don't travel 1,500 miles to marry a stranger. That takes guts, even if the stranger turned out to be a liar. The bluntness should have stung, but instead it felt oddly liberating. Colt Maddox didn't traffic in polite fictions or careful euphemisms. He simply said what was true. Do you know him? Elise asked. Thomas Hale? Colt's expression closed slightly. I know of him. He runs cattle sometimes, does some trading. Not a rancher, more of a middleman. Buys low, sells high, moves around a lot. And Mary Sullivan? Daughter of one of the bigger ranchers in the territory. Sullivan's spread is 3 times the size of mine. Marrying her would give a man like Hale a lot of advantages. The implication was clear. Elise, with her small savings and lack of connections, offered Thomas Hale nothing of value. Mary Sullivan offered him a fortune and social standing. The choice, from a purely mercenary perspective, was obvious. I was such a fool, Elise whispered. You were trusting. That's not the same thing. Isn't it? No. Colt's voice was firm. A fool doesn't learn. A trusting person who gets betrayed, they learn. They grow. They become someone who can't be fooled again. You're not a fool, Elise Warren. You're someone who believed in good faith and got burned for it, but that's on him, not you. The words settled into Elise's chest like a balm on a wound she hadn't known how to name. For the first time since stepping off that train, she felt something other than shame and humiliation. She felt anger, clean, righteous anger at Thomas Hale for his deception, and a fierce determination not to let his betrayal define her. Thank you, she said again. Colt just nodded as though he'd done nothing more remarkable than point out the weather. They sat in comfortable silence as the storm raged outside, drinking coffee and listening to the wind howl. Eventually, Colt stood and checked the fire, adding more wood to keep the warmth steady. Storm should blow through by morning, he said. We'll head to the ranch once it's safe to travel. For now, you should get some rest. You can take the bunk. I'll sleep in the chair. Elise looked at the narrow bunk, then at Colt's tall frame, then back at the bunk. You can't possibly be comfortable in a chair all night. I've slept in worse places. Colt, Elise. He met her eyes steadily. You've had one hell of a day. Your feet are still recovering from frostbite, you're exhausted, and you're in a tiny cabin with a man you met 3 hours ago. The least I can do is let you sleep in an actual bed without worrying about where I am. So please, just take the bunk. Put that way, Elise couldn't argue. She moved to the bunk and lay down, still wrapped in the blanket, her feet throbbing with returning circulation. The bunk was hard and narrow, but it was warm, and she was so tired that even the thin mattress felt like luxury. Colt settled into the chair near the stove, his long legs stretched out in front of him, his hat pulled low over his eyes. Within minutes, his breathing had evened out into the deep rhythm of sleep. Elise watched him in the flickering firelight. This stranger, who had appeared at exactly the right moment, who had offered help without expecting anything in return, who had treated her with more respect in a few hours than Thomas Hale had shown in 2 years of letters. Tomorrow, she would have to face the reality of her situation. Tomorrow, she would have to begin building a new life from the ashes of her ruined plans. Tomorrow, she would have to be strong and capable and brave. But tonight, in this small cabin while a blizzard raged outside, she could simply rest. And for now, that was enough. Dawn broke cold and clear, the kind of crystalline morning that only follows a brutal storm. Elise woke to the sound of Colt moving around the cabin, the creak of floorboards and the soft clink of the coffee pot against the stove. For one disoriented moment, she couldn't remember where she was, and then it all came rushing back. The empty platform, the blizzard, the stranger who had saved her life. She sat up slowly, wincing as her feet protested the movement. They were still tender, but the sharp pain of last night had faded to a dull ache. Through the small window, she could see snow piled high against the cabin walls, glittering in the early sunlight. "Morning," Colt said, not turning from the stove. "How are your feet?" "Better." Elise's voice came out rough with sleep. "Sore, but better." "Good. That means no lasting damage." He poured coffee into a tin cup and brought it to her. "We need to get moving soon. The ranch hands will be worried, and Mrs. Chen is probably ready to organize a search party." Elise took the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around its warmth. In the morning light, she could see Colt more clearly, the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the way his shirt was wrinkled from sleeping in the chair. He'd given up his comfort for hers without hesitation, and the gesture sat heavy in her chest. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked. "Enough." He moved to the door, opening it to assess the snow. "Looks like we got about 8 inches. Rosie can manage it, but we'll need to go slow." "What about the wagon?" "I'll send some of the hands back for it once we're home. Your trunk will be fine. It's locked up tight." He glanced back at her. "You ready for this? It's going to be a cold ride." Elise thought about the alternative, staying in this tiny cabin indefinitely, waiting for spring perhaps. She nodded. "I'm ready." Colt helped her with her boots, which had dried stiff by the fire. Her stockings were still damp, but there was no help for that. She stood carefully, testing her feet, and found she could walk without too much pain. Outside, the world had been transformed. Snow covered everything in pristine white, smoothing out the rough prairie into gentle curves and drifts. The sky was impossibly blue, and the air so cold it burned Elise's lungs with each breath. Rosie stood where Colt had sheltered her against the cabin wall, looking remarkably unbothered by the whole ordeal. "Up you go," Colt said, helping Elise onto the horse before swinging up behind her. His arm came around her waist, steady and sure, and Elise found herself relaxing against him as they started across the snow-covered prairie. The ride was slow and cold, but in the morning light, Elise could actually see the landscape Colt was navigating. Rolling hills stretched in every direction, broken by occasional stands of cottonwood trees along creek beds. In the distance, she could see what looked like cattle, dark shapes against the white snow. "Those yours?" she asked, pointing. "Some of them. We run about 300 head across 2,000 acres. Not the biggest operation in Dakota, but it's sustainable. Good grazing, reliable water from the creek." As they rode, Colt pointed out landmarks, a distinctive boulder, a bend in the creek, a lone pine tree that marked the northern boundary of his property. He was teaching her to see the land the way he did, Elise realized, giving her the knowledge she'd need to navigate this new world. "There," Colt said finally, and Elise followed his gaze to see buildings emerging in the distance. Maddox Creek Ranch. It wasn't what Elise had expected. In Thomas's letters, he'd described a grand house with a wraparound porch and carved banisters, something transplanted from the South. But Colt's ranch was purely practical, a solid 2-story house built of logs and stone, a large barn, several outbuildings, and corrals. It looked like it had grown out of the land itself, sturdy and unpretentious. As they approached, Elise saw a figure emerge from the house, a small, straight-backed woman with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun. She stood on the porch with her hands on her hips, and even from a distance, Elise could feel the force of her displeasure. "That's Mrs. Chen," Colt said, and there was amusement in his voice. "And I'm about to get the lecture of my life for staying out all night in a storm." "Mr. Maddox!" Mrs. Chen's voice carried clearly across the snow. You ride out in a blizzard without telling anyone where you're going. You stay out all night, and you come back with... She stopped abruptly as Colt helped Elise down from the horse, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. Who is this? This is Miss Elise Warren, Colt said calmly. She was stranded at the station yesterday. The storm caught us before we could make it back, so we sheltered at the North Line shack. Mrs. Chen's expression shifted from anger to concern in an instant. She hurried down the porch steps, her gaze sweeping over Elise with the efficiency of someone accustomed to assessing situations quickly. Stranded? In that storm? Child, you must be frozen through. Come inside immediately. Mrs. Chen, I was thinking Miss Warren could stay in the guest room, Colt began. Obviously, she'll stay in the guest room. What kind of house do you think I run? Mrs. Chen had already taken Elise's arm and was guiding her toward the house. You, Mr. Maddox, can see to that horse and then tell the hands you're alive. They've been pacing like caged animals all morning. Elise looked back at Colt, suddenly uncertain about being separated from the one person she knew, but he just smiled and tipped his hat. You're in good hands. Mrs. Chen will take care of you. The inside of the house was warm and smelled like coffee and bacon. Mrs. Chen led Elise through a comfortable sitting room and up a steep staircase to a small bedroom on the second floor. It was simply furnished, a bed with a colorful quilt, a dresser, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the ranch yard. Sit, Mrs. Chen commanded, and Elise obeyed, sinking onto the bed. The housekeeper knelt and began unlacing Elise's boots with gentle but efficient hands. Mr. Maddox said you were stranded. May I ask what happened? Elise found herself telling the whole story. Thomas Hale, the unanswered promise, the empty platform. Mrs. Chen listened without interrupting, her face growing increasingly stern. That man, she said finally, pulling off Elise's second boot, is what we call a snake oil salesman. All charm and promises, no substance. She examined Elise's feet carefully. Some frostbite, but Mr. Maddox treated it properly. You'll be fine in a few days. You don't seem surprised, Elise observed. About Thomas Hale, I mean. I'm not. I've seen men like him before. They come west looking for easy money, easy women, easy everything. They don't last. Mrs. Chen stood and moved to the washstand, pouring water from a pitcher into the basin. But you will last, Miss Warren. I can see it in you. How can you possibly know that? Because you're still here. You could have gotten back on that train, gone home to Boston, admitted defeat. But you didn't. You accepted Mr. Maddox's offer and rode through a blizzard to get here. That's not the behavior of someone who gives up easily. The observation was so matter-of-fact, so confident, that Elise felt something warm bloom in her chest. Mr. Maddox said you might need help. With the house, the garden, the spring work. Mr. Maddox was being modest. I desperately need help. Mrs. Chen handed Elise a warm, damp cloth for her face and hands. I'm not as young as I used to be, and this house doesn't run itself. If you're willing to work, and I mean real work, not the light housekeeping you might have done back east, then we can help each other. I'm willing, Elise said. I need to earn my keep. I won't accept charity. Good. I don't give charity. I give wages and respect to those who earn them. Mrs. Chen moved to the door. I'm going to bring you breakfast and some clothes. My daughter left several dresses here before she married and moved to Cheyenne. You're about her size. Once you've eaten and changed, we'll discuss the work schedule. She paused in the doorway, her expression softening slightly. Welcome to Maddox Creek Ranch, Miss Warren. I think you'll find it's a good place to heal. After Mrs. Chen left, Elise sat on the bed, looking around the simple room that was now hers. Through the window, she could see Colt in the ranch yard, talking with several men who must be his hands. Even from here, she could see the easy way he moved among them, the respect in how they listened when he spoke. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Chen entered with a tray laden with bacon, eggs, fresh bread, and coffee. Behind her came a girl of about 16 with an armload of dresses. This is Jenny, Mrs. Chen said. She comes up from town twice a week to help with the heavy cleaning. Jenny, this is Miss Warren. She'll be staying with us. Jenny's eyes went wide with curiosity, but she bobbed a polite curtsy. Pleased to meet you, miss. Help Miss Warren try these dresses, Mrs. Chen instructed. Find her something practical for around the house. She turned to Elise. Eat while the food's hot. Jenny will take care of the rest. Once Mrs. Chen had left, Jenny proved to be a cheerful whirlwind of helpfulness. She chattered constantly as she held up various dresses for Elise's approval, sharing tidbits of information about the ranch, the town, and everyone who lived within 20 miles. Mr. Maddox is the best rancher in the territory, Jenny said, helping Elise into a simple gray dress with a white collar. Fair to his hands, honest in his dealings, and he don't tolerate nonsense. My pa says he's the kind of man the West was built for. How long have you worked here? 2 years now. Started when I was 14. Mrs. Chen is strict, but she's taught me everything, cooking, preserving, how to manage a household proper. Ma says I'll make some man a fine wife someday because of what I've learned here. Jenny fastened the buttons at Elise's back. There. That fits you perfect. You're right pretty, Miss Warren, if you don't mind me saying. Elise looked at herself in the small mirror over the dresser. The dress was plain but well made, and it fit her reasonably well. With her hair tidied and her face washed, she looked almost normal, not at all like a woman whose entire life had collapsed 24 hours ago. Thank you, Jenny. Oh, it's nothing. Say, is it true you were supposed to marry Thomas Hale? News traveled fast, apparently. Yes, but he didn't show up. Jenny's face twisted with disgust. Good riddance, I say. That man's nothing but trouble. He tried to cheat my pa on a cattle deal last year. Pa saw right through him, but not everyone's so sharp. She lowered her voice conspiratorially. Between you and me, Mary Sullivan is welcome to him. They deserve each other. Before Elise could ask what she meant, Mrs. Chen's voice called up the stairs. Jenny, stop gossiping and bring Miss Warren down when she's ready. We have work to do. Jenny grinned unrepentantly. Yes, Mrs. Chen. She helped Elise with her hair, pinning it up in a simple style, then led her back downstairs. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Mrs. Chen put Elise to work immediately, showing her around the kitchen, the pantry, the root cellar. They baked bread together, prepared stew for dinner, and began planning the spring garden. Mrs. Chen worked with the efficiency of long practice, but she was patient in her explanations, making sure Elise understood not just what to do, but why. Out here, we can't just run to a market when supplies run low, Mrs. Chen explained as they inventoried the root cellar. Everything needs to be planned, preserved, stored properly. Winter is long, and if you haven't prepared properly, you can find yourself in real trouble. Elise found herself absorbed in the work. It was different from running her sister's household in Boston, more physical, more essential, more connected to survival itself. But it was satisfying in a way she hadn't expected. As afternoon faded toward evening, the ranch hands began filing in for dinner. They were a varied group, some young, some old, some taciturn, some friendly, but they all treated Elise with polite respect, tipping their hats and murmuring greetings before taking their places at the long table in the dining room. Colt came in last, having changed his clothes and cleaned up. He took his place at the head of the table and gestured for Elise to sit at his right. Everyone, this is Miss Elise Warren. She'll be helping Mrs. Chen around the house. I expect you all to treat her with the same respect you'd show any lady. There was a chorus of, yes, boss, and of course, Mr. Maddox, and then dinner began. The food was simple but plentiful. The stew Elise and Mrs. Chen had made, fresh bread, butter, and strong coffee. The conversation flowed easily around the table, the men discussing the day's work, the condition of the cattle, plans for spring branding. Elise listened, fascinated by this glimpse into a world she'd never imagined. These men worked from dawn to dusk in all weather, doing backbreaking labor for modest wages. But there was pride in how they spoke about the ranch, respect in how they talked about Colt's management. After dinner, while Mrs. Chen and Jenny cleaned up, refusing Elise's help with firm instructions to rest her feet, Colt invited Elise into his study, a small room off the main sitting area, lined with books and dominated by a large desk covered in papers. "How was your first day, he asked, gesturing for her to take one of the leather chairs by the fireplace. "Exhausting, enlightening, strange." Elise settled into the chair. "Mrs. Chen is formidable." "That she is, but fair. She'll work you hard, but she'll teach you everything you need to know about running a frontier household." Colt poured 2 glasses of whiskey and offered one to Elise. "I know it's not proper for ladies back east, but out here, it's medicinal, good for sore feet." Elise took the glass, though she'd never had whiskey in her life. The first sip burned going down, but warmth spread through her chest almost immediately. Is everything out here justified as medicinal? Only the things that actually help. Colt sat in the chair across from her. I need to talk to you about something. Your trunk arrived. A couple of the hands brought the wagon in this afternoon. But there was something else. A telegram came through to the station this morning. Elise's stomach dropped. From Thomas? No, from someone named Margaret Warren. Your sister, I'm guessing. Yes. Elise set her whiskey glass down with shaking hands. What did it say? Colt pulled a folded paper from his pocket and handed it to her. Elise opened it with trembling fingers. Elise, stop, return home immediately. Stop, we'll send money for ticket. Stop, this madness must end. Stop, Margaret. The words blurred in front of Elise's eyes. Margaret, ever practical, ever convinced she knew best. Of course she would demand Elise return. Of course she would see this as madness rather than possibility. You don't have to respond right away, Colt said gently. Take time to think about what you want. What I want? Elise laughed, but there was no humor in it. I wanted to build a life here. I wanted to be married, have a home, maybe children someday. But that's not going to happen, is it? Thomas Hale saw to that. Thomas Hale saw to one version of that future, Colt corrected. But there are other versions, other possibilities. Like what? Becoming a permanent housekeeper? Working for wages until I'm too old to work anymore? Like becoming independent, building something of your own. Colt leaned forward, his blue eyes intent. Elise, I've been thinking. Deadstone needs a school teacher. The last one got married and moved to Bismarck 6 months ago. The position comes with a small cottage, a salary, and respect. You're educated. I can tell by how you speak, how you carry yourself. You could do it. Elise stared at him. You're suggesting I become a school teacher? Why not? You're capable. You're educated. And it would give you something Thomas Hale's broken promises never could. True independence. A life that's yours, built on your own terms. The idea was so unexpected, so far from anything Elise had considered, that she couldn't quite process it. I've never taught before. But you can read, write, do arithmetic. That's more than most people out here. The school board isn't looking for someone with fancy credentials. They're looking for someone who can teach children their letters and numbers and maybe inspire them to think beyond the next cattle drive. You have this all figured out, don't you? I've been up since 4 this morning thinking about it. Colt smiled slightly. Seemed better than dwelling on how close we came to freezing to death last night. Despite everything, Elise felt her lips twitch. You have a strange way of processing near-death experiences. Practical. I process them practically. He stood and moved to his desk, returning with a folder. This is information about the teaching position. Salary, responsibilities, housing. Look it over. Think about it. There's no rush. Elise took the folder, but she didn't open it. Instead, she looked at Colt, really looked at him. This man who had found her abandoned on a platform, who had risked his own safety to shelter her from the storm, who was now offering her a path to independence she'd never imagined. Why are you doing this? She asked. Why do you care what happens to me? Colt was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and honest. Because I know what it's like to have everything you counted on fall apart. I came out here 8 years ago running from a life back in Missouri that had gone sour. Lost my family's farm to bad debt. Lost my fiancé to my best friend. Lost everything I thought I was building. I came west with nothing but anger and desperation. What changed? The land, the work, the realization that I could build something new instead of mourning what I'd lost. He met her eyes. A man named Samuel Pritchard, the station master's brother, gave me a chance when no one else would. Let me work his ranch, learn the trade, save up money. He didn't have to. I was nobody to him. But he said something I've never forgotten. Son, everybody deserves a second start. Question is whether you're brave enough to take it. And were you? Brave enough? Some days yes, some days no. But I took it anyway, and it became the best decision I ever made. Colt gestured around the study. This ranch, this life, it's not what I planned, but it's real. It's mine. And it's better than anything I left behind. Elise felt tears prick her eyes. Not from sadness, but from the unexpected gift of being understood. I don't know if I'm that brave. You rode through a blizzard with a stranger. You're still here instead of on the first train back east. I'd say you're braver than you think. Colt stood. It's late, and you've had a hell of a couple of days. Get some rest. We can talk more tomorrow. As Elise climbed the stairs to her room, she clutched the folder about the teaching position and thought about Margaret's telegram demanding she return home. She thought about Thomas Hale and his hollow promises. She thought about Colt Maddox and his quiet certainty that she could build something new. In her room, she finally opened the folder. The teaching position paid $30 a month. Not much, but enough to live on. The cottage was small but private, with 2 rooms and a garden plot. The responsibilities were straightforward. Teach reading, writing, arithmetic, and basic history to children ages 6 to 14. It was real, practical, possible. Elise pulled out paper and a pen from her trunk, miraculously undamaged despite the storm, and began to write. But not to the school board, not yet. Dear Margaret, she wrote, I received your telegram. I appreciate your concern, but I will not be returning to Boston. I have found work here and am pursuing a teaching position. I am safe, I am employed, and I am building a future that is mine. Please do not worry. Your loving sister, Elise. She folded the letter, addressed it, and set it aside to post tomorrow. Then she wrote a second letter. This one to the Deadstone School Board, expressing her interest in the teaching position and requesting an interview. When both letters were finished, Elise changed into the nightgown Mrs. Chen had provided and climbed into bed. Through the window, she could see stars scattered across the vast Dakota sky, so many more than she'd ever seen in Boston. The vastness should have been frightening, but instead it felt like possibility. Somewhere out there, Thomas Hale was probably sleeping beside Mary Sullivan, congratulating himself on his clever deception. Let him. His betrayal had closed one door, but it had opened another. One that led to a life Elise was beginning to realize she wanted more than the one she'd planned. As she drifted toward sleep, she heard voices from below, Colt and Mrs. Chen talking quietly. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was warm, familial. This house, this ranch, these people, they were becoming something she hadn't expected. They were becoming home. The next morning, Elise woke before dawn to the sound of activity in the ranch yard. She dressed quickly in another of the borrowed dresses and made her way downstairs to find Mrs. Chen already at work in the kitchen. Good, you're up, the housekeeper said without preamble. We have a lot to do today. The hands need breakfast, there's laundry to be done, and I want to start planning the spring garden properly. Elise tied on an apron and threw herself into the work. By the time the sun was fully up, she'd helped prepare breakfast for 12 people, learned how to work the washing tub, and begun sketching out garden plots under Mrs. Chen's exacting instruction. It was hard work, harder than anything she'd done in Boston. But it was also satisfying in a way that surprised her. Each task completed was visible, tangible proof of her contribution. She was earning her place here, building value with her own hands. Around mid-morning, Colt found her hanging laundry in the yard, her hands red from the cold water, and her back aching from bending over the tub. You have a visitor, he said, and something in his tone made her look up sharply. Who? Sheriff Anderson. He wants to talk to you about Thomas Hale. Elise's stomach clenched. She followed Colt into the house, where a tall man with a silver star pinned to his vest waited in the sitting room. He had a weathered face and kind eyes, and he stood when Elise entered. Miss Warren, he said, removing his hat. I'm Sheriff Tom Anderson. I apologize for the intrusion, but I need to ask you some questions. About Thomas Hale? Yes, ma'am. See, you're not the first woman he's done this to. There's been 3 others over the past 2 years, all sent money for train fare, all left standing at various stations when he didn't show up to claim them. The room tilted. 3 others? Yes, ma'am. We've been trying to build a case against him for fraud, but the women all left town before we could get statements. You're the first one who stayed. Sheriff Anderson pulled out a small notebook. If you're willing to make a statement about what happened, the letters, the money he requested, the promises he made, it would help us pursue charges. Elise looked at Colt, who nodded encouragingly. Then she looked back at the sheriff. What would happen to him if charges were filed? Depends on what we can prove. Wire fraud carries serious penalties. He could be looking at prison time, or at minimum, he'd have to make restitution to the women he defrauded. And Mary Sullivan? What about her? Sheriff Anderson's expression turned sympathetic. That's complicated, ma'am. If she knows about his schemes, she could be complicit, but more likely she's just another woman being deceived. Either way, that's between them. Elise thought about the other 3 women, her sisters in betrayal, scattered across the territory, nursing their broken hearts and shattered dreams. She thought about how close she'd come to being just another casualty of Thomas Hale's greed. I'll make a statement, she said firmly. Tell me what you need. For the next hour, she recounted everything, the letters, the promises, the money sent for her fare, her arrival at the empty platform. Sheriff Anderson took careful notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When they were finished, he had her sign the statement. Thank you, Miss Warren. This is going to help a lot of women. He stood and put his hat back on. You should know, Thomas Hale is going to find out you've filed charges. He might try to intimidate you or convince you to drop them. If he comes around, you send word to me immediately. He won't come around, Colt said quietly, and there was steel in his voice. Miss Warren is under my protection. Hale knows better than to set foot on my land. The sheriff nodded approvingly. Good man, Maddox. Miss Warren, you're in good hands here. He tipped his hat. I'll be in touch if we need anything else. After the sheriff left, Elise found herself shaking, not from fear but from the adrenaline of having taken action instead of simply accepting what had been done to her. You all right? Colt asked. I think so. I can't believe there were others. 3 other women he did this to. Men like Hale see people as tools to be used. He probably figured women desperate enough to come west as mail-order brides wouldn't have the resources or courage to fight back. Colt's expression was grim. He figured wrong with you. I haven't done anything brave. I just answered questions. You stayed. You refused to run. That's braver than you think. Colt hesitated, then added, The school board sent word this morning. They want to interview you tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Elise's heart leaped. That's fast. They're desperate. The children have been without proper schooling for months. If you're even halfway qualified, the job is yours. He smiled slightly. And Elise? You're more than halfway qualified. That night, Elise lay awake, running through possible interview questions and reviewing everything she knew about teaching. She had no formal training, but she'd helped her sister tutor her nieces and nephews. She knew literature, history, basic mathematics. It would have to be enough. The next morning, Colt drove her into Deadstone in his wagon. The town was smaller than Elise had imagined. One main street lined with wooden buildings, a handful of side streets, maybe 500 people total. But it was neat and well-maintained, with a church at one end and a schoolhouse at the other. The schoolhouse was a simple one-room building with rows of desks and a large chalkboard. 3 members of the school board were waiting. Mr. Pritchard, the station master who gave Elise an encouraging nod. Mrs. Sullivan, an imposing woman who Elise realized must be Mary Sullivan's mother. And Reverend Hayes, a kindly-looking man with spectacles. The interview was mercifully straightforward. They asked about her education, good, her experience with children, limited but honest, and her commitment to staying in Deadstone, carefully worded but firm. Mrs. Sullivan was the most skeptical, her sharp eyes assessing Elise as though looking for weakness. I understand you were recently jilted by Thomas Hale, Mrs. Sullivan said bluntly. How do I know you won't cause trouble for my daughter, who is currently courting him? The question was designed to humiliate, but Elise met Mrs. Sullivan's eyes steadily. Ma'am, I have no interest in Thomas Hale. He made promises he didn't intend to keep, and I've moved on. Your daughter is welcome to him. My only interest is in this teaching position and in building a respectable life in Deadstone. Something shifted in Mrs. Sullivan's expression, not warmth exactly, but a grudging respect. She nodded curtly and said no more. After the board conferred briefly, Reverend Hayes smiled at Elise. Miss Warren, we'd be pleased to offer you the position, beginning immediately. The cottage behind the school needs some cleaning, but it's habitable. Your salary will be $30 monthly, paid at the end of each month. Welcome to Deadstone. Elise felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back and smiled. Thank you. I won't let you down. As she and Colt drove back to the ranch, Elise felt something she hadn't felt since stepping off that train. Hope. Real, solid hope. You did it, Colt said, glancing at her with unmistakable pride. You're officially a schoolteacher. I can't quite believe it. Believe it. You earned it. He paused, then added quietly, though I'll admit I'm going to miss having you at the ranch. Mrs. Chen's already planning to steal you back for Sunday dinners. I'd like that, Elise said, and realized she meant it. This ranch, these people, they'd become important to her in just a few short days. Colt, I want to thank you for everything. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't. Don't, he interrupted gently. You would have found a way. You're the kind of person who survives, Elise. I just happen to be convenient. But they both knew it was more than convenience. It was kindness, freely given at exactly the right moment. That evening, as Elise packed her trunk to move into the schoolhouse cottage, she found herself standing at her bedroom window, looking out over Maddox Creek Ranch one last time. Below, she could see Colt working with one of the horses in the corral, his movements confident and sure. She'd arrived here broken, abandoned, with nothing but a trunk full of foolish dreams. In less than a week, she'd found work, filed charges against the man who'd betrayed her, and secured a position that would give her independence. But more than that, she'd found something she hadn't known she was looking for, a place where her worth wasn't determined by who chose to marry her, but by what she chose to build for herself. It wasn't the life she'd planned. But as she watched the sunset paint the Dakota sky in shades of gold and crimson, Elise realized it might be something better. It might be hers. The schoolhouse cottage smelled of dust and disuse when Elise first stepped inside, but she saw past the grime to the possibility beneath. 2 rooms, a main living area with a small kitchen alcove and a bedroom barely large enough for a bed and wash stand. The windows needed washing, the floors needed scrubbing, and there was a mouse nest in one corner that made her jump back with a startled yelp. But it was hers. It's not much, Reverend Hayes said apologetically, hovering in the doorway. The last teacher kept it quite nice, but it's been empty since autumn. It's perfect, Elise said, and meant it. She'd lived in grand houses in Boston, slept in rooms 3 times this size. But those rooms had never truly belonged to her. This tiny cottage, with its dusty floors and mouse-inhabited corners, was hers to clean, hers to arrange, hers to make into a home. Colt, who had insisted on accompanying her into town, set her trunk down in the bedroom. You're going to need supplies. Cleaning things, at minimum. Probably some furniture, too. This place is pretty bare. I'll make a list, Elise said, already mentally cataloging what she'd need. I have a little money saved from... She stopped, not wanting to mention Thomas Hale's name. From the train fare he sent, Colt finished for her, his voice matter-of-fact. That's your money, Elise. He owes you far more than that. Reverend Hayes cleared his throat delicately. The church has some spare furniture in storage. Nothing fancy, but serviceable. I'll have it brought over this afternoon, and the ladies' auxiliary usually welcomes new teachers with a basket of essentials. You won't starve, at least. After Reverend Hayes left, Elise stood in the middle of her cottage and felt the weight of what she'd done settle over her. She'd chosen this, not because a man had promised her a future, not because society expected it of her, but because she wanted it. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. You're quiet, Colt observed, leaning against the doorframe. Second thoughts? No, just adjusting. A week ago, I was on a train thinking I was heading toward marriage. Now I'm standing in a cottage I'll live in alone, about to start teaching children I've never met. Life has a way of taking sharp turns. Colt's blue eyes were understanding. The question is whether you can handle the ride. Can I? Elise asked, and she wasn't entirely sure if she was asking him or herself. Only one way to find out. He pushed off the doorframe. Come on, let's get this place cleaned up before the furniture arrives. Mrs. Chen sent cleaning supplies. She had a feeling you'd need them. They worked through the afternoon, Elise scrubbing floors while Colt dealt with the mouse nest and repaired a broken window latch. It was strange working alongside him in such domestic proximity. In Boston, it would have been scandalous, an unmarried man and woman alone together. But out here, practical needs trumped propriety, and Elise found herself grateful for his steady presence. Tell me about the children, she said as she washed the windows. What should I expect? Colt paused in his work on the latch. Wide range. Some of them come from educated families and can already read well. Others are ranch kids who've never seen the inside of a book. Ages 6 to 14, though the older boys don't always come regularly, their families need them for ranch work. How many students? Last count was about 18, could be more or less depending on the season and whether families have moved. He got the latch working and tested it several times. The real challenge will be keeping them all engaged when they're at such different levels. You seem to know a lot about teaching for a rancher. I was a student once, had a teacher back in Missouri who managed a one-room schoolhouse with 40 kids. She taught me that education isn't about treating everyone the same. It's about meeting each person where they are and helping them get to where they need to be. His voice went distant. Miss Abernathy, probably the smartest person I've ever known, and she spent her whole life in a town of 300 people teaching farm kids their letters. Did you keep in touch with her? She died the winter before I left Missouri, pneumonia. Colt's jaw tightened. The whole town turned out for her funeral. Even the adults who'd been her students came back to pay respects. That's when I realized something important. What? That the value of a life isn't measured in wealth or status. It's measured in how many lives you touch, how many people you help become better versions of themselves. He met Elise's eyes. You're going to touch a lot of lives here, Elise. These kids, they'll remember you for the rest of their days. The responsibility of it struck Elise like a physical weight. She sat back on her heels, the window half cleaned, and felt the enormity of what she'd taken on. What if I'm not good enough? What if I fail them? Then you'll learn and do better the next day. That's all any teacher can do. Colt crossed to where she sat and extended his hand. Come on, you're tired, and we've done enough for today. Let's get some food in you. They ate dinner at the hotel restaurant, a luxury Elise protested but Colt insisted on. Consider it a congratulations on your new position, he said as they settled into a corner table. The restaurant was modest, with checkered tablecloths and the smell of roasting meat, but after days of hard work it felt almost elegant. As they waited for their food, Elise noticed people glancing their way, whispers passing between tables. A middle-aged woman with elaborate curls approached, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Mr. Maddox, she said with exaggerated warmth, how lovely to see you in town. And this must be the new schoolteacher everyone's talking about. Mrs. Winters, Colt said politely, standing. May I introduce Miss Elise Warren? Miss Warren, Mrs. Winters runs the general store. How fascinating, Mrs. Winters said, her eyes traveling over Elise with undisguised curiosity. I heard you came all the way from Boston to marry Thomas Hale. Such a shame about that unfortunate situation. The false sympathy was worse than outright hostility. Elise kept her voice level. It was indeed unfortunate. Fortunately, I've found a much better situation teaching Deadstone's children. Oh, of course. Though I must say it's quite unusual for a woman in your circumstances to take on such a position. People do talk, you know. Let them talk, Elise said with more confidence than she felt. I have work to do. Mrs. Winters' smile froze. Well, how refreshing. She turned to Colt. Mr. Maddox, give my regards to Mrs. Chen. Such a treasure, that woman. You're lucky to have her managing your household, what with you being unmarried and all. After she left, Elise let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. That was unpleasant. That was Deadstone politics, Colt said, retaking his seat. Mrs. Winters is the town's unofficial arbiter of respectability. If she disapproves of you, she'll make sure everyone knows it. And does she? Disapprove? Probably. But Mrs. Winters disapproves of everyone who doesn't bow to her standards. Don't let her get under your skin. He paused as their food arrived. Besides, you have allies here. Reverend Hayes, the Pritchards, Mrs. Chen, me. That counts for more than Mrs. Winters' approval. As they ate, Elise found herself studying Colt across the table. He was unlike any man she'd known in Boston. Rough around the edges, direct to the point of bluntness, utterly unconcerned with social niceties. Yet there was a fundamental decency to him that made her feel safer than she'd felt in years. Can I ask you something? She said. Always. Why haven't you married? You've built a successful ranch. You're respected in the community. Surely there are women who'd... She stopped, realizing how forward the question sounded. But Colt didn't seem offended. There are. Mrs. Winters has tried to introduce me to every eligible woman within 50 miles. He cut into his steak thoughtfully. The truth is, after what happened in Missouri, losing my fiancé to my best friend, I decided I didn't want to marry for convenience or social expectation. If I ever marry, it'll be because I find someone I can't imagine living without. Someone who sees me clearly and chooses me anyway. That's a high standard. Maybe, but I'd rather be alone than settle for less. He looked at her directly. What about you? Is marriage still something you want, after everything with Thomas Hale? Elise considered the question seriously. I don't know. A week ago, I would have said yes without hesitation. Marriage was supposed to be my future, my security, my purpose. But now, I'm not sure. I have a job, a home, independence. Maybe that's enough. Maybe it is. Or maybe you'll find that marriage and independence aren't mutually exclusive. Colt smiled slightly. You don't have to decide now. You have time to figure out what you want your life to look like. They finished dinner in comfortable silence. Then Colt drove Elise back to her cottage. The furniture had arrived as promised, a simple bed frame and mattress, a small table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair that had seen better days, and a washstand. The ladies' auxiliary basket sat on the table, overflowing with bread, preserves, eggs, and basic staples. You're all set, Colt said, surveying the cottage. You need anything else before I head back to the ranch? Elise looked around her tiny home. Clean now, furnished, ready to become whatever she made of it. No, I think I have everything I need. Colt hesitated at the door, his hat in his hands. Elise, I want you to know, if you ever need anything, anything at all, you send word. The ranch isn't far, and I meant what I said about you being under my protection. Why? The question escaped before Elise could stop it. Why do you care so much about what happens to me? Colt was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was low and honest. Because when I look at you, I see someone who deserves better than what she got. And because... He stopped, seeming to wrestle with something. Because you remind me that good people exist in this world. That courage isn't always loud. That starting over is possible. Before Elise could respond, he'd settled his hat on his head and stepped out into the night. Sleep well, Miss Warren. Your students will be waiting come Monday morning. After he left, Elise stood in her quiet cottage and felt tears slip down her cheeks. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming strangeness of having landed in this life. She cried for the future she'd lost, yes, but also for this unexpected present she'd found. For kindness from strangers. For second chances. For the terrifying freedom of building her own path. That weekend passed in a blur of preparation. Elise visited the schoolhouse, familiarizing herself with the supplies, arranging the desks, planning lessons. She met some of the parents as they stopped by to introduce themselves and assess the new teacher. Most were welcoming, though a few regarded her with the same skeptical curiosity Mrs. Winters had shown. Sunday morning, true to Mrs. Chen's promise, Colt arrived at the cottage to escort Elise to church, and then to the ranch for dinner. The service was simple but heartfelt, Reverend Hayes preaching about new beginnings and God's grace. Elise found herself genuinely moved, though she couldn't tell if it was the sermon or simply the accumulated emotion of the past week catching up with her. As they were leaving the church, Elise saw them, Thomas Hale and Mary Sullivan, standing near the church entrance. Thomas was exactly as he'd described himself in his letters, tall, well-dressed, with dark hair and an easy smile. Mary was beautiful in a cold sort of way, her blonde hair elaborately styled, her dress the finest Elise had seen in Deadstone. Thomas's eyes met Elise's, and she saw recognition flash across his face, followed quickly by something that looked like calculation. He started toward her, but Colt's hand settled firmly on Elise's elbow, guiding her in the opposite direction. "Don't," Colt said quietly. "He's not worth your time." But Thomas called out anyway. "Miss Warren, I heard you'd arrived in Deadstone. I owe you an explanation." Elise stopped and turned, pulling herself up to her full height. "No, Mr. Hale. You owe me 2 years of my life and the money you fraudulently obtained for my train fare. The sheriff has my full statement. I suggest you speak to your lawyer, not to me." Thomas's easy smile faltered. Mary Sullivan's eyes narrowed dangerously. "I told you she was trouble," Mary hissed, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I'm not trouble, Miss Sullivan," Elise said calmly. "I'm simply someone who refuses to be victimized quietly. I hope for your sake that Mr. Hale is more honest with you than he was with me and the 3 other women he defrauded." The gathered crowd gasped. Thomas's face went red, but before he could respond, Colt stepped forward, positioning himself between Thomas and Elise. "I believe Miss Warren has said all she needs to say," Colt said, his voice deceptively mild but with an edge of steel beneath. "And I believe you have somewhere else to be, Hale." For a moment the 2 men stared at each other, and Elise saw something pass between them, a challenge, an understanding, a line drawn. Then Thomas grabbed Mary's arm and stalked away, leaving whispers and speculation in his wake. "That was bold," Colt murmured as they walked to his wagon. "That was necessary," Elise replied, her heart pounding. "I won't let him make me feel ashamed when he's the one who should be ashamed." Colt's smile was genuine and approving. "Good. Don't ever let him." Dinner at the ranch was a welcome respite from the drama at church. Mrs. Chen had outdone herself with roast chicken, fresh bread, vegetables from the root cellar, and an apple pie that made Elise close her eyes in appreciation. The ranch hands joined them, and the conversation flowed easily around the table. Talk of upcoming spring work, cattle prices, weather predictions. After dinner, while Mrs. Chen and Jenny cleaned up, Colt invited Elise to walk with him around the ranch. The afternoon was crisp and clear, the kind of day that hinted at spring while still holding winter's chill. "You handled Thomas Hale well," Colt said as they walked past the corrals. "Most people would have avoided confrontation. I spent 2 years believing in a fiction he created. I won't spend another moment pretending I'm the one who should be embarrassed." Elise watched a pair of horses grazing in the pasture. "Besides, if I'm going to teach children in this town, I need to establish that I won't be pushed around." "The children are going to love you," Colt said with certainty. "Or fear you. Possibly both." Elise laughed. "Is that what you want in a teacher?" "It's what I want in any person worth knowing, someone who has convictions and the spine to stand by them." They'd reached the creek that ran along the southern edge of the property, its water running clear and cold over smooth stones. "This is why I named the ranch Maddox Creek. When I first came here, this creek was the only thing on this land besides grass and sky. I built everything else around it." "It's beautiful," Elise said, and meant it. The landscape was so different from Boston's manicured parks and tidy gardens, but there was a raw beauty to it that appealed to something deep in her chest. "It grows on you," Colt agreed. "The first year I thought I'd made a terrible mistake. The loneliness was crushing, the work was endless, and I didn't know if I'd survive the winter, but then spring came and I saw what this land could become. I saw what I could become. And what's that? Someone who matters, not because of family name or inherited wealth, but because of what I build with my own hands." He looked at her directly. "That's what you're doing too, you know, building something that matters." "I'm just teaching children their ABCs." "You're giving them tools to build their own futures. That's not just anything." They stood by the creek in comfortable silence, watching the water flow past. Elise felt something shift in her chest. Not attraction exactly, though she was aware of Colt in a way she hadn't been before. It was more like recognition, like seeing someone clearly and understanding suddenly that they saw her clearly too. "I should get back to town," she said reluctantly. "I have lesson plans to finalize before tomorrow." "Of course." Colt turned back toward the house. "I'll drive you." On the ride back to Deadstone, Elise found herself thinking about the strange path that had led her here. If Thomas Hale had shown up at the station as promised, she would be married now, living whatever life he'd planned for her. She would have a house, certainly, and the social status that came with being a married woman. But would she have this sense of purpose? This feeling that she was building something meaningful? "Thank you," she said as Colt helped her down from the wagon at her cottage, "for everything. For saving me from that storm, for helping me find this position, for standing beside me at church today." "You don't need to thank me for doing what any decent person would do." "But you're not any decent person," Elise said quietly. "You're someone extraordinary pretending to be ordinary." Colt looked startled, then pleased, then almost shy, an expression that seemed at odds with his rugged exterior. Get some sleep, Elise. Tomorrow's a big day. That night, as Elise lay in her narrow bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the cottage settling around her, she thought about Colt's words by the creek. Building something that matters. Was that what she was doing? Or was she simply surviving, making the best of a bad situation? But as sleep claimed her, she realized it didn't matter which it was. What mattered was that she was here, alive, moving forward. And tomorrow she would stand in front of 18 children and begin a new chapter, not the one she'd planned, but perhaps the one she was always meant to write. Monday morning arrived cold and bright. Elise dressed carefully in one of her borrowed dresses, pinned her hair up in a severe bun that she hoped looked authoritative, and walked the short distance to the schoolhouse with butterflies rioting in her stomach. The children were already gathering when she arrived, some with parents who wanted to assess the new teacher, others in groups of siblings who'd walked from nearby ranches. They ranged from tiny 6-year-olds clutching dinner pails to lanky 14-year-old boys who looked at her with undisguised skepticism. Elise took a deep breath, straightened her spine, and stepped into the schoolhouse. Every face turned toward her, dozens of eyes assessing, judging, waiting to see what kind of teacher she'd be. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "My name is Miss Warren, and I'm delighted to meet all of you. Please take your seats, and we'll begin." The children shuffled into the desks, some eagerly, some reluctantly. Elise scanned their faces, noting who seemed confident and who seemed nervous, who was well-dressed and who wore patched clothes, who met her eyes and who looked away. "I know you've been without a teacher for some time," she continued, "so we're all starting fresh together. I'm going to learn what each of you knows and what you need to learn, and you're going to help me understand how to teach you best. Does that sound fair?" A small girl in the front row raised her hand tentatively. "Are you the lady who was supposed to marry Mr. Hale?" The room went utterly silent. Every child leaned forward, eager to hear how she'd respond to this test. Elise met the little girl's eyes calmly. "I am. Mr. Hale and I were engaged, but that engagement ended. Now I'm Miss Warren, your teacher, and that's the only role that matters in this classroom. Does anyone have questions about schoolwork?" A boy in the back, one of the 14-year-olds, raised his hand. "Can you actually teach us anything, or are you just here because you needed a job?" It was deliberately confrontational, designed to rattle her. But Elise had spent years managing her sister's difficult children. She knew how to handle challenges to her authority. "That's an excellent question," she said, walking toward the back of the room. "What's your name?" "Jacob Morrison." "Well, Jacob, I'm here because this town needs a teacher, and I'm qualified to do the job. Whether I can actually teach you anything depends on whether you're willing to learn. Are you?" Jacob blinked, clearly not expecting to have his challenge turned back on him. Yeah, I guess." "Good. Then we understand each other." She turned back to address the whole class. "I have high expectations for all of you. I expect you to work hard, to treat each other with respect, and to challenge yourselves. In return, I promise to do my best to help each of you become the best student you can be. Now, let's start with reading. I want to assess what level everyone is at." The day passed in a blur of assessments, name learning, and establishing routines. Some of the children were remarkably advanced. The Sullivan twins could read at a level well beyond their age. Others were nearly illiterate. Several of the ranch children had barely been taught their letters. The challenge of teaching them all in one room was daunting, but Elise found herself energized rather than overwhelmed. By the time she dismissed them at 3 o'clock, she was exhausted but exhilarated. She'd survived her first day. More than survived. She'd established her authority, identified each child's level, and begun to build the structure that would carry them through the year. As the last child left, Elise sank into her chair and let out a long breath. Then she heard a knock at the door. Colt stood in the doorway, hat in hand, a slight smile on his face. "How was it?" he asked. "Terrifying, wonderful, exhausting." Elise laughed. "One of the children asked me about Thomas Hale within the first 5 minutes. How did you handle it?" "I told them the truth, that it ended and now I'm their teacher." She stood and began gathering papers. "Was I right to do that?" "Absolutely. Children respect honesty." Colt stepped into the schoolhouse, looking around at the neat rows of desks, the carefully written alphabet on the chalkboard. "This looks good, Elise. You look good, like you belong here." "I think I might," she said, surprised by how much she meant it. "It's strange. I came here expecting to be someone's wife, to build my life around supporting someone else's dreams. But this, teaching these children, building my own purpose, it feels right in a way nothing in Boston ever did. That's because it is yours, not something you're doing for someone else or because society expects it. Yours." They walked back to her cottage together, Colt carrying her bag of papers and books, Elise telling him about the students, the bright ones who needed challenging, the struggling ones who needed patience, the mischievous ones who needed firm boundaries. "You're a natural at this," Colt observed. "The way you talk about them. You already care about these children." "How can I not? They're so themselves, unguarded in a way adults never are." She unlocked her cottage door. "Would you like to come in? I have coffee, and I owe you for checking on me." Colt hesitated, and Elise saw him weighing propriety against desire. Finally, he nodded, just for a few minutes. Inside, Elise put coffee on to boil while Colt settled into the rocking chair. The cottage had begun to feel like home. She'd added small touches over the weekend, arranging her books on a makeshift shelf, hanging curtains Mrs. Chen had helped her make, placing wildflowers in a jar on the table. "You've made this place yours already," Colt said, looking around approvingly. "It's not much, but it's mine." Elise poured coffee into 2 cups. "That still feels miraculous somehow. 2 weeks ago, I owned nothing. Now I have a home, a job, a purpose." "You always had purpose, Elise. You just didn't know it yet." Colt accepted the coffee cup. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you miss Boston, your sister, your old life?" Elise considered the question honestly. "I miss my sister sometimes. We didn't always get along, but she's family. But the life? No. I was suffocating there, pretending to be satisfied with a future I didn't want. I thought I wanted marriage and children and a traditional life, but I think I really just wanted to escape the emptiness of being dependent on my sister's charity. And now? Now I'm dependent on my own abilities. It's terrifying and liberating in equal measure." She sat across from him. "What about you? Do you ever miss Missouri?" "I miss what I thought Missouri was. But that life, the farm, my fiancé, my best friend, none of it was real. I was building my future on foundations that didn't exist." His blue eyes were distant. "Coming west saved me from living a lie. It forced me to build something real." They sat in comfortable silence, drinking coffee, as the afternoon light slanted through the windows. Elise found herself studying Colt's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his hands wrapped around the coffee cup, the small scar above his left eyebrow that she'd never noticed before. "Can I ask you something?" she said softly. "Always. That day at the station, when you found me, why did you stop? You could have ridden past, left me to figure things out on my own." Colt was quiet for a long moment. "Because I recognized the look on your face. I'd worn it myself 8 years ago when I arrived in Dakota with nothing, lost, scared, trying desperately to hide both. I couldn't ride past that. Most people would have. Then most people are cowards." He set his coffee cup down. "Elise, I need to tell you something. The past couple of weeks, getting to know you, watching you build this new life, it's been remarkable. You're remarkable. And I find myself, that is, I've come to—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. Elise's heart began to pound. "What are you trying to say?" "I'm saying that my feelings for you have become more than just wanting to help a stranger. I care about you, Elise, more than is probably wise given how recently you arrived and how vulnerable your position is." He met her eyes. "But I needed to be honest. I won't act on these feelings. I won't put you in an awkward position or make demands. But I wanted you to know." The confession hung in the air between them. Elise felt 1,000 emotions swirl through her chest: surprise, pleasure, fear, uncertainty. Part of her wanted to laugh at the absurdity. She'd been in Deadstone for 2 weeks, had just started a new job, was barely recovered from Thomas Hale's betrayal. This was terrible timing. But another part of her, The part that had been growing stronger every day she spent in Colt's presence whispered that timing didn't matter, that what mattered was the steady warmth she felt when he was near, the way he saw her clearly and valued what he saw, the quiet certainty that he would never leave her standing on a platform. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "2 weeks ago, I thought I was in love with a man I'd never met. Then I discovered that man never existed. Now you're telling me you care about me, and She took a breath. "I care about you too. But I'm also terrified of trusting my feelings. What if I'm wrong again?" "You're not wrong," Colt said gently. "What you felt for Thomas Hale was based on words and imagination. This," he gestured between them, "this is based on reality. You know who I am, Elise. You've seen me at my most practical, my most honest. There's no fiction here." "I know. And that's what scares me most. Because if this is real, then it matters more than anything I felt before." She twisted her hands in her lap. "Colt, I need time. I need to build my own life, prove to myself that I can stand on my own. I can't jump from depending on one man's promises to depending on another man's feelings. I'm not asking you to depend on me. I'm just asking you to leave the door open to the possibility that we could build something together. Not now, not soon, but someday. When you're ready. If you're ever ready." The offer was so generous, so patient, that Elise felt tears prick her eyes. "I can leave that door open," she said quietly, "but I can't promise anything more. I'm not asking for promises. I've learned that promises are easy to make and hard to keep. I'm asking for possibility, for you to let this, whatever this is between us, develop naturally, without pressure or expectation. I can do that." Colt smiled, and the relief in his expression was palpable. "Good. Then nothing has to change. We'll continue as we have been, friends, neighbors, people who respect each other, and we'll see where the path leads." He stood, setting his hat back on his head. "I should go. Mrs. Chen will have dinner waiting, and I need to check on the south pasture before dark." Elise walked him to the door. "Thank you for your honesty, and for your patience. Thank you for yours." He paused at the threshold. "Same time next week? Sunday dinner at the ranch?" "I'd like that." After he left, Elise closed the door and leaned against it, her heart still racing. Colt Maddox cared for her. The knowledge settled into her chest like a warm coal, glowing steadily. She wasn't ready to examine what it meant yet, wasn't ready to decide what she felt in return. But for the first time since arriving in Dakota, she felt something she hadn't expected. She felt hope for a future she might actually want, not one built on someone else's promises, but one built brick by brick on honest affection and genuine respect. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to begin with. Spring arrived in Dakota like a promise kept, transforming the brown prairie into rolling waves of green dotted with wildflowers. Elise had been teaching for 6 weeks, and the rhythm of her days had become as natural as breathing. Wake before dawn, prepare lessons, teach until mid-afternoon, grade papers and plan for the next day, then fall into bed exhausted but satisfied. Every Sunday, Colt arrived at her cottage to escort her to church and then to the ranch for dinner with Mrs. Chen and whoever happened to be around. They had fallen into an easy friendship, careful and respectful of the boundary Elise had drawn, but unmistakably growing deeper with each passing week. On a particularly warm afternoon in late April, Elise dismissed her students early to enjoy the sunshine. As they scattered across the schoolyard with whoops of joy, she noticed Jacob Morrison lingering by her desk, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Jacob, did you need something?" The 14-year-old who had challenged her on the first day had become one of her most dedicated students, devouring every book she could give him. But now he looked uncomfortable, almost embarrassed. "Miss Warren, that is, my ma wanted me to invite you to dinner. This Sunday, if you're free." Elise was touched. The Morrisons ran a modest ranch north of town, and she knew from Jacob's younger siblings that money was tight. "That's very kind of your mother, but I wouldn't want to impose." "Ma insists," Jacob said quickly. "She says you've done right by us kids, teaching us proper, and she wants to thank you. Plus, she wants to hear about Boston. We don't get many folks from back east." Something in his earnest expression made Elise's chest tighten. "Then I'd be honored. What time should I arrive? After church? We could ride together. I'll have the wagon. Perfect. Thank you, Jacob. After he left, Elise found herself smiling as she tidied the schoolhouse. These small connections, dinner invitations, grateful parents, children who actually wanted to learn, were weaving her into the fabric of Deadstone in a way she'd never experienced in Boston. She was no longer the abandoned mail-order bride or the desperate woman who'd taken the teaching job out of necessity. She was Miss Warren, the school teacher, a valued member of the community. That Sunday, true to his word, Jacob waited after church with a wagon. But before Elise could climb up, Colt appeared at her elbow. "You're not joining us at the ranch today?" he asked, and she heard the disappointment beneath the casual tone. "The Morrisons invited me to dinner. I couldn't refuse. It would have been rude." "Of course." Colt's expression was understanding, but something flickered in his eyes. "Mrs. Chen will miss you. She's been experimenting with a new pie recipe all week." "Tell her I'll come by next Sunday to try it," Elise said, then added more quietly, "I'll miss it too. The dinners, I mean." "Just the dinners?" Colt's voice was equally quiet, and there was something searching in his gaze. Before Elise could answer, Jacob called from the wagon. "Miss Warren, we should get going. Ma doesn't like folks being late." The Morrison ranch was smaller than Colt's spread, but tidy and well-maintained. Mrs. Morrison, a weathered woman with kind eyes and capable hands, greeted Elise warmly, ushering her into a house that smelled of roasting chicken and fresh bread. Jacob's 3 younger siblings crowded around, suddenly shy in the presence of their teacher outside the classroom. Over dinner, Mrs. Morrison peppered Elise with questions about Boston, about teaching, about how she was settling into Deadstone. Mr. Morrison, a taciturn man who clearly let his wife do most of the talking, occasionally grunted approval at something Elise said. "Jacob tells us you've been working with him on his reading," Mrs. Morrison said as she served pie. "Says you lent him books from your own collection." "Jacob has a natural gift for literature," Elise replied. "It would be a shame not to nurture it." "Ain't no future in books for a ranch boy," Mr. Morrison said, speaking for the first time since Grace. "Boy needs to learn cattle and horses, not poetry." "With respect, Mr. Morrison, Jacob needs both," Elise said carefully. "The world is changing. Education opens doors that might not exist yet. And even if Jacob stays on the ranch his whole life, books can enrich that life in ways that matter." Mr. Morrison studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Suppose there's truth in that. My pa couldn't read more than his own name, and it made life harder than it needed to be." After dinner, Jacob walked Elise to the wagon for the ride back to town. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for what you said to Pa. He doesn't always see the value in schooling, but he respects you. Your father wants what's best for you. He just needs to understand that education is part of that." Elise climbed into the wagon. "Keep reading, Jacob. Keep asking questions. Don't let anyone tell you curiosity is wasted on a ranch boy." As Jacob drove her home through the lengthening shadows, Elise thought about the life she was building. These connections, these small moments of impact, they mattered in ways her old life never had. In Boston, she'd moved through society like a ghost, present but not truly seen. Here she was real, tangible, necessary. The cottage was dark when she arrived, and after Jacob left, Elise lit a lamp and settled into her rocking chair with a stack of papers to grade. But her mind kept wandering to Colt, to the way his face had fallen when she'd said she was dining with the Morrisons. She'd been careful these past weeks, maintaining the friendship they'd established, not pushing against the boundaries she'd set. But underneath that careful distance, something was growing, something she wasn't quite ready to name but could no longer deny. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Colt standing on her step, hat in hand, looking almost uncertain. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said. "I just wanted to make sure you got home safely." "The Morrisons live 6 miles away. Of course I got home safely." "I know, but I—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. "Can I come in?" Elise stepped aside and Colt entered, filling the small cottage with his presence. He didn't sit, just stood in the middle of the room, turning his hat in his hands. "What's wrong?" Elise asked. "Nothing's wrong. Everything's fine, better than fine." He took a breath. "That's the problem. I told myself I could be patient. I told myself I'd wait until you were ready. But Elise, watching you drive off with Jacob Morrison today, I realized something. What? I don't want to wait anymore. Not because I'm impatient, but because waiting feels like wasting time we could be spending building something together. He set his hat down and crossed to where she stood. These past weeks, seeing you every Sunday, watching you become part of this community, seeing you thrive in the life you've built, I've fallen in love with you, Elise Warren. Completely. Irrevocably. And I need you to know that. Elise's breath caught. The confession was so direct, so honest, that it stripped away all her carefully constructed defenses. Colt, you don't have to say anything. You don't have to feel the same way. I just needed you to know where I stand because pretending otherwise is driving me half mad. He ran a hand through his hair. I'm not Thomas Hale. I won't make promises I can't keep or paint pretty pictures of futures that don't exist. What I'm offering is real. Messy and complicated and real. A life building this ranch, raising cattle, dealing with drought and debt and every hardship the West can throw at us. But doing it together, as partners, as equals. I know you're not Thomas Hale, Elise said, her voice shaking. That's what terrifies me. With Thomas, I could tell myself I'd been fooled, that I'd fallen for fiction. But with you, I know exactly who you are. If I let myself love you and it goes wrong, I'll have no one to blame but myself. It won't go wrong. You can't know that. No, Colt admitted. I can't promise you perfect happiness or a life without hardship. But I can promise you honesty, respect, a partner who will stand beside you through whatever comes. Isn't that better than guarantees of perfection that no one can actually keep? Elise felt tears slip down her cheeks. When did you become such a poet? When I fell in love with a woman who deserves poetry. Colt reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed the tears from her cheeks with his thumb. Tell me what you're thinking, please. I'm thinking that I've been lying to myself, Elise whispered, pretending that what I feel for you is just gratitude or friendship, when the truth is, I started falling for you the moment you carried me into that line shack and wrapped my frozen feet like they mattered, like I mattered. You do matter, more than anything. I'm scared, Colt. I'm scared of losing myself again, of building my life around someone else's dreams instead of my own. Then don't. Build your own dreams and let me build mine, and we'll see where they intersect. His hands framed her face gently. Elise, I'm not asking you to give up teaching or your independence or any part of the life you've built. I'm asking you to let me be part of it, to let us see if what we're building separately might be stronger built together. The words unlocked something in Elise's chest, a fear she'd been carrying since the moment she'd stepped off that train and found no one waiting. The fear that love meant losing herself, that partnership meant surrender. But Colt wasn't asking for surrender. He was offering collaboration. I love you, she said, and the words felt like stepping off a cliff. I've been trying not to, trying to protect myself, but I love you, Colt Maddox, and that terrifies me. Colt's smile was radiant. Say it again. I love you. One more time. I love you, you impossible man. He kissed her then, and Elise melted into it, into him, into the certainty that this was right in a way nothing else in her life had ever been. His lips were warm and gentle, asking rather than demanding, and when they finally pulled apart, Elise was breathless. So what happens now? She asked. Now we build something together, Colt said. Slowly, carefully, in a way that honors both of us. I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow, Elise. I'm just asking you to stop pretending you don't want this as much as I do. I do want this. I want you. The admission felt like freedom. But I need to keep teaching. I need my independence. I wouldn't ask you to give it up. What kind of man would I be if I fell in love with your strength and then tried to take it away? He took her hands. We'll figure out the details as we go. For now, all I need to know is that you're willing to try. I'm willing, Elise said, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones. I'm terrified, but I'm willing. That's all I ask. They spent the rest of the evening talking, planning, dreaming out loud about what a future together might look like. Colt would keep the ranch, of course, and Elise would continue teaching. They'd marry, eventually, when Elise felt ready, and she could either commute to the school from the ranch, or they'd find a way to make the cottage work. The details were fuzzy, but the foundation was solid. Two people who respected each other, loved each other, and were committed to building a life that honored both their dreams. When Colt finally left well past midnight, Elise stood at her window and watched him ride away into the darkness. Her heart felt too large for her chest, expanding with a joy she'd almost forgotten was possible. The next weeks passed in a blur of happiness. Colt came to town more frequently, always with some excuse: supplies to pick up, business at the bank, a word with the sheriff about the Thomas Hale case, which was slowly grinding through the legal system. But everyone in Deadstone knew the real reason. Colt Maddox was courting Miss Warren, and he wasn't bothering to hide it. The gossip was immediate and enthusiastic. Mrs. Winters, of course, had opinions, which she shared liberally with anyone who would listen. That poor girl, throwing herself at the first man who showed her kindness. Mark my words, it'll end badly. But for every Mrs. Winters, there were a dozen Mrs. Chens and Reverend Hayeses and Morrison families who were genuinely happy to see Elise building a life that included love as well as independence. The town began to embrace them as a couple, inviting them to dinners, making knowing comments at church, treating it as a foregone conclusion that they'd marry. Elise found she didn't mind. For the first time in her life, she was part of a community that celebrated her choices rather than judging them. And having Colt beside her, solid, supportive, unfailingly kind, made everything better. One Saturday in mid-May, Colt arrived at the cottage with a picnic basket and an invitation. "I want to show you something. Can you spare a few hours?" "For you? Always." They rode out from town on horseback, Elise having finally grown comfortable enough with riding to manage on her own. Colt led her across the prairie, past his ranch, up into the hills beyond. They climbed higher and higher until finally he stopped at a meadow Elise had never seen before. It was spectacular. Wildflowers carpeted the ground in every color imaginable: purple larkspur, yellow buttercups, white daisies, red paintbrush. The meadow sloped gently down toward a view of the valley below, where the creek wound like a silver ribbon through green grassland. Beyond that, the prairie stretched to the horizon, vast and beautiful and free. "Colt, this is breathtaking," Elise breathed, dismounting to walk among the flowers. "I found it my second year here," Colt said, following her into the meadow. "Was chasing a stray cow and ended up here completely by accident. I come here when I need to think. When the weight of the ranch gets too heavy, when I need to remember why I chose this life. Thank you for sharing it with me. I want to share more than this with you." Colt turned to face her, taking her hands. "Elise Warren, I know we agreed to take things slow. I know you need time and space to be certain, but I'm certain. I've been certain since the moment you stood in my line shack with frostbitten feet and a broken heart and still found the courage to keep going. So I'm asking you now, in this place that matters to me more than anywhere else in the world, will you marry me?" Elise's heart stopped. This was too fast, too soon. They'd only been courting for a few weeks. She should ask for more time, should be practical and cautious, and "Yes," she heard herself say. "Yes, Colt Maddox, I'll marry you." The joy on his face was worth every moment of fear. He pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around while she laughed with pure, uncomplicated happiness. When he set her down, he kissed her thoroughly, and Elise kissed him back with all the certainty she'd been afraid to feel. "I don't have a ring yet," Colt said when they finally pulled apart. "I wanted to ask you first, make sure you'd say yes before I presumed. I don't need a ring. I just need you." "You'll get both," he promised. "The best ring I can afford, and me, forever." They spread the picnic blanket among the wildflowers and spent the afternoon making plans. They'd marry in July, giving Elise time to finish the school term and plan a proper wedding. Mrs. Chen was already scheming about the ceremony. She'd made Colt promise to let her organize it. They'd live at the ranch, and Colt would drive Elise to school each morning and pick her up each afternoon until they could figure out a better arrangement. "What if the school board objects?" Elise asked. "Some places don't allow married women to teach." "Then we'll fight that rule. Your students need you, married or not. And if the board won't see reason, we'll find another way." Colt's voice was firm. "I meant what I said, Elise. I'm not asking you to give up your life for mine." As the sun began to set, Painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and crimson, Elise leaned against Colt's chest and felt something she'd never expected to feel again: complete and utter peace. She'd come to Dakota broken and lost, expecting one future and finding it destroyed. But in its place, she'd built something better: a life of her own choosing, work that mattered, love that was real. "What are you thinking?" Colt asked, his arms wrapped around her. "I'm thinking that if Thomas Hale had shown up at that platform, I never would have found this. Never would have found you." "Should we thank him then?" "Absolutely not. He's still a lying, manipulative fraud," Elise smiled. "But I'm grateful for the path that brought me here, even if it hurt at the time." "Me too," Colt kissed the top of her head, "though I'd have preferred to meet you without the frostbite and heartbreak." "Where's the romance in that?" He laughed, and the sound rumbled through his chest into Elise's back. They sat in comfortable silence as stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Elise counting constellations she'd never seen in Boston's light-polluted nights. "I should get you back," Colt said reluctantly. "It's getting late, and people will talk." "Let them talk. We're engaged now. We're allowed to spend time together." "Mrs. Chen will have my hide if I don't get you home at a respectable hour. She has very specific ideas about proper courtship." They rode back to Deadstone slowly, neither wanting the day to end. At Elise's cottage, Colt helped her down from her horse and held her close for a long moment. "I love you," he said simply. "I love you too. I'll see you tomorrow at church. We can tell everyone the news. Mrs. Winters is going to have an apoplexy." "Good. Woman needs some excitement in her life." After he left, Elise floated into her cottage, too happy to sleep. She lit a lamp and pulled out writing paper, penning a letter to her sister that began, "Dear Margaret, I have the most wonderful news." The announcement at church the next morning caused exactly the sensation they'd expected. Reverend Hayes was delighted, offering to perform the ceremony. Mrs. Chen actually cried, clutching Elise's hands and declaring she'd known from the beginning that they were meant for each other. The children from Elise's class crowded around, asking if they'd still have a teacher after she got married, which Elise assured them they would. Mrs. Winters predictably pursed her lips and muttered something about unseemly haste, but even she couldn't completely hide a grudging approval. A successful rancher and a respectable schoolteacher was, after all, an acceptable match by anyone's standards. Only one person seemed less than thrilled. Mary Sullivan, standing with Thomas Hale near the church entrance, looked at Elise with such venomous envy that Elise actually took a step back. "Congratulations, Miss Warren," Mary said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I hope you'll be very happy, though I must say it seems quite sudden. You've only been in Deadstone a few months." "When you know, you know," Elise replied calmly. "Mr. Maddox and I suit each other well." "Of course. A rancher and a teacher. Very practical." Mary's eyes flicked to Thomas, who was studiously avoiding looking at Elise. "Some of us prefer romance to practicality." "Romance without substance is just pretty words," Colt said, appearing at Elise's side and taking her hand. "I'll take substance over pretty words any day." The barb hit its mark. Thomas flushed red, but Mary just laughed, a brittle sound that held no real mirth. "How fortunate for you both. Come along, Thomas. We have places to be." After they left, Elise let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. That was unpleasant. "That was Mary Sullivan realizing she bet on the wrong horse," Colt corrected. "Thomas Hale's legal troubles are mounting. Word is the circuit judge is taking the fraud charges seriously. Mary's father is not pleased about his daughter's association with a man facing potential prison time." "I almost feel sorry for her." "Don't. She knew what he was and chose him anyway because she thought his charm would serve her ambitions." Colt squeezed her hand. "You chose differently. You chose real." The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a flurry of preparation. Mrs. Chen took charge of everything, organizing a ceremony at the ranch that would include the entire town. Elise finished the school term with excellent marks from her students, and the school board confirmed that her marriage would not affect her position. A small but significant victory that felt like validation of everything she'd fought for. 3 days before the wedding, a telegram arrived from Boston. Margaret was coming. She'd arrived the day before the ceremony, she wrote, because she wasn't about to miss her only sister's wedding, even if that sister had lost her mind and married a cowboy in the middle of nowhere. "Should I be worried?" Colt asked when Elise showed him the telegram. "Terrified," Elise said cheerfully. "Margaret is formidable, opinionated, and completely convinced she knows what's best for everyone. But she's my sister, and I love her, even when she drives me mad." Margaret arrived on the Wednesday afternoon train, and Elise was waiting at the platform, that same platform where her life had fallen apart 3 months earlier. But this time, she wasn't waiting with desperate hope. She was waiting with joy, ready to share her happiness with the sister who had tried so hard to protect her. Margaret stepped off the train looking exactly as Elise remembered, tall, elegant, with perfectly coiffed hair and a traveling suit that probably cost more than Elise's entire wardrobe. Her eyes swept the platform, landed on Elise, and softened. "Look at you," Margaret said, pulling Elise into a fierce hug. "You look different, happy." "I am happy." "Good. That's all that matters." Margaret stepped back, studying her sister. "Though I reserve the right to judge this cowboy of yours thoroughly before I give my blessing. He's not a cowboy, he's a rancher. There's a difference." "I'm sure there is, though I haven't the faintest idea what it might be." Margaret linked her arm through Elise's. "Now, take me to meet this man who's convinced you to stay in this God-forsaken wilderness." Colt was waiting at the cottage, nervous in a way Elise had never seen him. He'd dressed in his best clothes, combed his hair, and was pacing the small space like a caged animal when they arrived. "Mr. Maddox," Margaret said, extending her hand. "I'm Margaret Warren, Elise's sister and self-appointed guardian of her well-being." "Ma'am," Colt said, shaking her hand. "It's an honor to meet you. Elise speaks of you often." "I'm sure she does. Probably complaining about my overbearing nature and tendency to meddle." Margaret sat in the rocking chair, arranging her skirts with practiced precision. "Now, Mr. Maddox, tell me why you think you're worthy of my sister." "Margaret!" Elise protested. "It's all right," Colt said. He sat across from Margaret, meeting her eyes directly. "Ma'am, I don't know if I'm worthy of your sister. She's intelligent, courageous, and capable of building a life out of nothing but determination and grit. What I can tell you is that I love her, I respect her, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to deserve the gift of her choosing me." Margaret studied him for a long moment, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Finally, she nodded. "That's the right answer, Mr. Maddox. The only right answer. A man who thinks he deserves a woman like Elise is a fool. A man who knows he doesn't but commits to earning it daily. That's a man worth marrying." The tension in Colt's shoulders eased. "Does this mean I have your blessing?" "Conditional blessing. Ask me again after I've seen how you treat her over the next few days." But Margaret was smiling. "Now, I understand there's a ranch I need to inspect and a housekeeper I need to meet. Shall we go?" The ride to Maddox Creek Ranch was filled with Margaret's questions, observations, and occasional sharp commentary on the landscape. But underneath the interrogation, Elise could sense her sister's approval growing. When they arrived at the ranch and Mrs. Chen greeted them, the two women took an immediate liking to each other, two formidable women recognizing kindred spirits. Over dinner that night, with the ranch hands on their best behavior and Margaret holding court at the table, Elise looked around and felt her heart swell. This was her family now, not just Colt, but Mrs. Chen and the Hands and even her prickly sister who'd traveled 1,500 miles to make sure Elise was truly happy. After dinner, Margaret pulled Elise aside. "He's good," she said simply. "Better than good. He looks at you like you hung the moon, but he also listens when you speak. That's rare, Elise. Most men only do one or the other." "I know. I'm lucky." "You're brave. There's a difference." Margaret squeezed her hand. "I'm sorry I tried to make you come home. I was scared for you, afraid you'd been hurt too badly to recover. But you didn't just recover. You thrived. You built exactly the life you were meant to have. I couldn't have done it without the strength you gave me growing up. All those years of telling me I was capable, that I didn't need a man to define me, I finally believe it. And now you're choosing to share your life with one anyway, which is exactly as it should be. Marriage isn't about need, it's about choice." Margaret smiled. "I'm proud of you, little sister. More proud than I can say." The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, the sky a brilliant blue that seemed to promise nothing but good things ahead. Mrs. Chen had transformed the ranch into something magical. Flowers everywhere, ribbons tied to fence posts, tables laden with food, and chairs arranged in rows facing an arch woven with wildflowers. In the bedroom that would soon be hers, Elise stood before a mirror in a simple white dress Mrs. Chen had helped her make. It wasn't fancy by Boston standards, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. And when Margaret came in to help with her hair, her sister's eyes filled with tears. "You're radiant," Margaret whispered. "I'm terrified." "Good terrified or bad terrified?" "Good. Definitely good." Elise turned from the mirror. "Is it time?" "It's time." They walked together to where Reverend Hayes waited under the arch, Colt standing beside him in a suit that made him look both handsome and slightly uncomfortable. But when his eyes found Elise, everything else fell away. There was only him, only her, only this moment they'd both chosen. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. Elise barely heard the words, too focused on Colt's face, on the way his hands trembled slightly when he slid the ring onto her finger, on the absolute certainty in his voice when he said, "I do." When Reverend Hayes pronounced them husband and wife, Colt kissed her with a gentleness that made the assembled crowd sigh collectively. Then they turned to face their community, friends, neighbors, students, everyone who had helped Elise build this new life. And Elise felt tears slip down her cheeks. "Why are you crying?" Colt murmured. "Because I'm happy. Because this is real. Because I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." "Yes," he said, smiling, "you are." The celebration lasted well into the night, with food and music and dancing under the stars. Elise danced with Colt, with her students, with ranch hands, even with Margaret, who proved surprisingly adept at frontier dancing despite her elegant sensibilities. As the evening wound down and guests began departing, Elise found herself standing at the edge of the ranch yard, looking up at the vast Dakota sky. She thought about this girl who had stepped off the train 3 months ago, heartbroken and lost and convinced her life was over. That girl seemed like a stranger now. "What are you thinking about?" Colt asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "About how strange life is. How the worst thing that ever happened to me led to the best thing." "Not so strange. Sometimes we have to lose the wrong path before we can find the right one." "And have I found it? The right path?" "I don't know about paths," Colt said, "but you found home and you found me. If that's not right, I don't know what is." Elise turned in his arms, looking up at the man who had saved her life and then helped her save herself. "Take me inside, husband. Our life is waiting." And hand in hand, they walked into the house that would become their home, ready to build the future they'd chosen together. A future built not on promises written in letters, but on love tested by blizzards and proven by time. A future that was wholly, completely, beautifully theirs. The first year of marriage was both harder and more beautiful than Elise had imagined. She continued teaching through the fall term, Colt driving her to town each morning in the wagon and picking her up each afternoon. The routine became a cherished part of their day, those quiet rides where they shared the small details of their separate worlds, weaving them together into something shared. But teaching from the ranch proved more complicated than either had anticipated. Winter came early and brutal that year, and there were days when the snow was too deep, the wind too fierce for the journey into town. Elise missed 3 full weeks of school in January, and the guilt of abandoning her students gnawed at her. "I can't keep doing this," she said one night, as she sat at the kitchen table trying to plan lessons around weather she couldn't predict. "The children need consistency. They need a teacher who can actually be there." Colt looked up from the ranch ledgers he'd been reviewing. "What are you saying?" "I don't know. Maybe I need to stay in town during the week when the weather's bad. Or maybe—" She stopped, not wanting to voice the thought that had been growing in her mind. "Maybe you need to give up teaching." Colt's voice was carefully neutral. "No. Yes, I don't know." Elise pressed her hands to her face. "I love teaching, Colt, but I also love being here with you, being part of the ranch, building this life. I feel like I'm being torn in two." Colt closed the ledger and moved to sit beside her, taking her hands in his. "Remember what I said when I proposed? That I wasn't asking you to give up your dreams for mine?" "I remember."
I meant it. If teaching matters to you, we'll find a way to make it work. If the commute is too difficult, maybe we build you a small cabin in town for the winter months. Or maybe we hire someone to handle the morning chores so I can stay in town with you. There are solutions, Elise. We just have to find them. But that's not fair to you. The ranch needs you here. The ranch needs both of us happy and fulfilled. If you're miserable because you had to give up teaching, that affects everything. He squeezed her hands. Talk to me. What do you really want? Elise took a shaky breath. I want both. I want to teach, and I want to be your wife, and I want to help build this ranch. But I'm starting to realize that maybe I can't have it all, not the way I imagined. What if we approach this differently? Colt said thoughtfully. What if instead of teaching year-round, you taught during the spring and fall when travel is easier and took the winter months off? The school could hire a substitute for those months, and you'd be here when the ranch work is hardest anyway. Elise considered this. It wasn't perfect. Her students would lose continuity, and she'd lose part of her salary. But it was a compromise that honored both her love of teaching and her commitment to the ranch, to Colt, to the life they were building together. You'd be all right with that? Half a teacher for a wife? I'd be all right with whatever makes you happy. And Elise, you're not half anything. You're whole, complete, exactly as you are. He smiled. Besides, Mrs. Chen has been campaigning for your help with the preserving and the winter sowing. She'd be thrilled to have you here full-time for those months. The arrangement proved workable. The school board, desperate to keep a good teacher, agreed to the modified schedule. Elise taught through May, took the summer months to help with the garden and the endless work of a ranch in growing season, then returned to teaching in September through November. December through March, she stayed at the ranch, working alongside Mrs. Chen, helping Colt with paperwork and planning, and slowly learning the rhythms of ranch life. It was during that first winter home that Elise discovered she was pregnant. She'd suspected for weeks, but hadn't been certain until Mrs. Chen, with her sharp eyes and knowing smile, had asked pointedly one morning if Elise had been feeling well. I'm fine, Elise had said too quickly. Fine like you were fine when you couldn't stomach breakfast 3 days running, or fine like you've been napping every afternoon for a week? Mrs. Chen's smile widened. Child, I've helped birth more babies than you've had hot dinners. I know the signs. Elise had burst into tears, half joy, half terror, and Mrs. Chen had held her while she cried, murmuring reassurances in a mixture of English and Chinese. That evening, Elise waited until after dinner, until the ranch hands had retired to the bunkhouse and she and Colt were alone in their bedroom. He was preparing for bed, his back to her, when she found her voice. Colt, I need to tell you something. He turned, immediately alert to the tremor in her voice. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. At least I don't think anything's wrong, but we're... She took a breath. I'm pregnant. The words hung in the air between them. Colt's face went through a series of expressions, shock, disbelief, wonder, before settling on pure, radiant joy. He crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. Are you sure? He whispered against her hair. Mrs. Chen is sure, and I trust her judgment more than my own. Elise pulled back to look at his face. Are you happy? I know we didn't plan this so soon. Happy? Elise, He seemed to struggle for words. I'm terrified and thrilled and completely overwhelmed. We're going to have a baby, our baby. You're not upset about the timing? When would have been better timing? Next year? The year after? He cupped her face in his hands. There's no perfect time for something this huge, but if I get to do this with you, then the timing is perfect enough. They spent the rest of the evening making plans, dreaming aloud about the life their child would have. A childhood on the ranch, learning to ride and rope and read, summers spent running wild across the prairie, winters learning by the fire, a life surrounded by love and land and possibility. But pregnancy in Dakota territory was not without its dangers, and as Elise's belly grew through the spring and early summer, so did Colt's worry. He fussed over her constantly, trying to prevent her from doing anything more strenuous than sitting down. Mrs. Chen, more practical, told Elise to keep moving, keep active,
that women had been having babies while working ranches since the beginning of time. "He means well," Mrs. Chen said one afternoon as they shelled peas on the porch while Colt hovered nearby. "But if he doesn't stop treating you like spun glass, you'll murder him before the baby arrives." "I'm considering it," Elise admitted, raising her voice slightly so Colt would hear. "I'm pregnant, not dying. I can still walk, work, live my life." "But what if something happens?" Colt protested. "What if you overexert yourself or—" "Then something happens and we deal with it. But I won't spend the next 3 months sitting in a chair like an invalid." Elise stood, her hand on her growing belly. "I'm going to check on the garden." She made it exactly 6 steps before a sharp pain lanced through her abdomen, so sudden and fierce that she gasped and doubled over. Colt was there instantly, catching her before she fell. "Elise, what's wrong?" "I don't know. Pain, sharp pain." Another wave hit, and Elise cried out. Mrs. Chen was already moving, her face calm but her movements urgent. "Get her inside, bedroom, now!" The next hours blurred together in a haze of pain and fear. Mrs. Chen examined Elise while Colt paced outside the bedroom door, and when the housekeeper emerged, her face was grave. "She's bleeding," Mrs. Chen said quietly. "Not much, but enough to be concerning. She needs to rest completely. No work, no walking around, nothing but lying down until this passes." "Will she be all right? Will the baby—" "I don't know. Sometimes these things resolve themselves. Sometimes they don't." Mrs. Chen's voice was gentle but honest. "All we can do is wait and hope." The waiting was agony. Elise lay in bed for 3 days, terrified to move, terrified that any motion might dislodge the precious life growing inside her. Colt barely left her side, holding her hand through the waves of pain and fear, reading to her when she couldn't sleep, simply being present when words failed. On the 4th day, the bleeding stopped. On the 5th, the pain eased. On the 6th, Mrs. Chen examined her again and pronounced, with cautious optimism, that the baby seemed to have held on. "But you need to rest," she warned, "for the next month at least. No strenuous work, no long walks, no teaching. Your body is trying to keep this baby, but you have to help it." Elise had never been good at resting, at sitting still while others worked around her, but the scare had shaken her deeply, and she followed Mrs. Chen's orders with religious devotion. Colt brought work to her, mending, ledgers to review, letters to write, anything to keep her occupied while keeping her in bed. "I'm sorry," she said one night as they lay together in the darkness. "I know this isn't how you imagined our first year of marriage." "Stop apologizing. This is exactly how I imagined it. You and me, facing whatever life throws at us, together." Colt's hand found hers in the dark. "Elise, I'm not disappointed. I'm grateful. Grateful that you're here, that the baby is still growing, that we have Mrs. Chen to guide us through this." "I'm scared," Elise whispered. "What if something happens? What if I can't?" "Then we'll face it together. But right now, in this moment, you're both here and safe. Let that be enough." The pregnancy progressed more smoothly after that frightening week. Elise followed every instruction, rested when told to rest, and by her 7th month, Mrs. Chen declared her out of danger. The baby was growing well, moving vigorously, making its presence known with kicks that made Elise laugh and wince in equal measure. On a crisp October morning, 3 weeks before her due date, Elise went into labor. It started as a dull ache in her back, easy to dismiss as the ordinary discomfort of late pregnancy. But by noon, the aches had become contractions, unmistakable and intensifying. "Colt," she called from the kitchen where she'd been helping Mrs. Chen with bread. "I think it's time." If Colt had been overprotective before, he was nearly frantic now. He sent one of the ranch hands racing to town for the doctor, though everyone knew the doctor wouldn't arrive in time. Ranch women gave birth with whoever was available, and for Elise, that meant Mrs. Chen, who had delivered more babies than most trained physicians. The labor was long and difficult. Hours blurred together, pain building and receding in waves that Elise rode with gritted teeth and determination. Mrs. Chen was a constant presence, offering cool cloths and words of encouragement, guiding Elise through each contraction with the calm certainty of experience. Colt stayed with her, despite Mrs. Chen's suggestion that he might prefer to wait elsewhere. He held Elise's hand, let her squeeze until his bones ached, murmured words of love and encouragement that Elise clung to like lifelines. "I can't," she gasped at one point, exhausted beyond measure. "I can't do this anymore." "Yes, you can," Colt said firmly. "You're the strongest person I know. You survived a blizzard, built a new life from nothing, faced down every challenge this territory has thrown at you. You can do this." "I'm scared." "I know, so am I. But we're doing it together, just like everything else." As sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Hannah Elizabeth Maddox entered the world with a lusty cry that filled the house with joy. Mrs. Chen placed the baby in Elise's arms, and Elise looked down at her daughter's tiny, perfect face and felt her heart crack open with a love so fierce it stole her breath. "She's beautiful," Colt whispered, his voice breaking. "You're both beautiful." "We made this," Elise marveled, touching Hannah's impossibly small fingers. "We made a whole person." "You made her, I just helped a little." "We made her together," Elise corrected, looking up at her husband with tears streaming down her face. "Like everything else worth having in this life." Motherhood transformed Elise in ways she couldn't have predicted. The fierce independence she'd fought so hard to maintain softened into something more flexible, more expansive. She still taught, but her schedule adapted around Hannah's needs. She still helped with the ranch, but she did so with a baby strapped to her back or sleeping in a basket nearby. The town fell in love with Hannah. Elise's students begged to hold her, to play with her, to help care for her. Mrs. Chen doted on the baby with a grandmother's devotion. And Colt, the strong, stoic rancher, turned to absolute mush whenever his daughter looked at him. 2 years later, their son Sawyer was born, an easier birth that lasted only 6 hours and produced a baby boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's stubborn determination. And 3 years after that, Grace arrived, a surprise baby that nonetheless completed their family in ways Elise hadn't known they needed. The years passed in a blur of scraped knees and first words, failed crops, and successful harvests, brutal winters and glorious springs. The ranch grew and prospered under Colt's management, and Elise's teaching became legendary in Deadstone. Former students returned as adults to thank her for the education that had opened doors they'd never imagined. But it wasn't all easy. There were years of drought when the cattle suffered and money grew tight. There was a fire that nearly destroyed the barn, saved only by the entire town turning out to fight the flames. There was a bout of scarlet fever that swept through Deadstone and nearly took Sawyer, leaving Elise and Colt sleepless for a week as they watched over their son's fevered sleep. Through it all, they held to each other. When Elise struggled with the isolation of ranch life, Colt found ways to bring the community to her. When Colt doubted his abilities as a rancher, Elise reminded him of how far he'd come, how much he'd built. They fought, as all couples do, but they never stopped choosing each other, never stopped working to build a partnership that honored both their individual strengths and their shared dreams. Margaret visited every few years, arriving with trunks full of gifts and stories from Boston society that felt increasingly foreign to Elise's ears. During one visit when Hannah was 5, Margaret sat on the porch watching the children play in the yard while Elise snapped beans. "You're happy," Margaret observed. "Genuinely, deeply happy in a way I never saw in Boston." "I am," Elise confirmed. "Not every moment, not every day, but overall, yes, this life suits me. It's so different from what you imagined when you left Boston. Does that ever bother you?" "Sometimes, but mostly I'm grateful things didn't go as planned. If Thomas Hale had been at that station, I would have married him, and I would have spent my whole life not knowing what I was missing." Elise looked at her children, at the ranch spread out before her, at Colt working with the horses in the corral. "This life chose me as much as I chose it, and I wouldn't trade it for anything." A decade after that first terrifying night in the line shack, Elise and Colt celebrated their 10th anniversary in the wildflower meadow where he'd proposed. The children were with Mrs. Chen for the night, giving them a rare evening alone. They spread a blanket among the flowers, different blooms than had been there in spring, but equally beautiful, and watched the sun set over the valley they'd made their home. If someone had told me 10 years ago that I'd be here, with you, with 3 children and a ranch and a life I love, I would have called them crazy, Elise said, leaning against Colt's shoulder. If someone had told me 10 years ago that I'd find a half-frozen woman on a train platform and fall completely in love with her, I probably would have said the same thing. Colt wrapped his arm around her. But here we are. Here we are, Elise echoed. Colt, can I tell you something? Always. I used to think that being left at that platform was the worst thing that ever happened to me. But I was wrong. It was the best thing. Because it brought me here, to you, to this life. And I wouldn't change a single moment of it. Not even the blizzard? The frostbite? Not even those. They were necessary to get us here, to this moment. She turned to look at him. I love you, Colt Maddox. Not because you saved me, but because you saw me clearly and loved me anyway. I love you, Elise Maddox. Not despite your strength, but because of it. He kissed her softly. Thank you for taking a chance on a stranger in a snowstorm. Thank you for being worth the chance. They stayed in the meadow until stars filled the sky, talking about the children, the ranch, the future they were still building together. When they finally rode back to the ranch house, they found all three children had escaped Mrs. Chen's supervision and were waiting on the porch, refusing to go to bed until their parents came home. We missed you, Hannah announced, throwing her arms around Elise's waist. We were only gone a few hours. But it was our special day too, Sawyer argued, because if you hadn't gotten married, we wouldn't exist. Sound logic, Colt said, ruffling his son's hair. All right, let's get you all to bed. Your mother and I will tell you the story. Again? Grace asked, but she was already pulling them toward the house. Again, Elise confirmed, because this was their family tradition. Every anniversary, she and Colt told the children the story of how they met. The empty platform, the blizzard, the stranger who had offered help without expecting anything in return. As she tucked Grace into bed and began the familiar tale, Elise marveled at the strange path her life had taken. She'd come west expecting one story, a traditional marriage, a conventional life. Instead, she'd found something far more valuable, a partnership built on mutual respect, a family created through love and determination, a home carved out of prairie and possibility. The life she'd planned would have been smaller, safer, more constrained by society's expectations. This life, messy and unpredictable and sometimes brutally hard, was vast and free and wholly hers. Years continued to pass, bringing new joys and new challenges. Jacob Morrison, the ranch boy who'd loved books, went east to university and returned to establish a small publishing house in Deadstone, printing everything from local newspapers to poetry collections. He never forgot the teacher who'd encouraged him to dream bigger, and he made sure Elise knew how much her faith had mattered. The Sullivan Ranch eventually failed, a combination of Thomas Hale's mismanagement and Mary's expensive tastes driving them into debt. Thomas faced charges for fraud and served 2 years in prison. Mary divorced him and married a banker from Cheyenne, never speaking to Elise again. Elise felt no satisfaction in their downfall, only a distant sadness for the life they'd wasted on appearances and ambition. Mrs. Chen eventually retired, though she never left the ranch. She moved into a small cottage Colt built for her on the property and spent her days teaching Hannah to cook, showing Sawyer how to tend a garden, and spoiling Grace with the kind of gentle affection only a grandmother could provide. As Elise entered her 40s, she gradually transitioned away from classroom teaching, though she never stopped educating. She tutored students who needed extra help, organized a small lending library in town, and wrote curriculum guides that were used throughout the territory. Her legacy wasn't just the students she'd taught directly, but the culture of learning she'd helped establish in Deadstone. The ranch thrived under Colt's steady management and expanded as their children grew old enough to help with the work. Hannah became an expert horsewoman, Sawyer showed a gift for cattle breeding, and Grace proved to have a head for the business side of ranching that impressed even Mrs. Chen. On their 20th anniversary, Colt surprised Elise with a gift, a bound book containing every letter Thomas Hale had written to her, along with a single page Colt had written himself. "Why would you give me these?" Elise asked, confused and a little hurt. "Open to the last page," Colt said. She did, and found Colt's handwriting covering the single sheet. "These letters promised you a life built on fiction. I want you to remember what you chose instead, a life built on truth. Every word in these letters was a lie designed to trap you, but you escaped that trap and built something real. Keep these not as a reminder of what you lost, but as proof of what you gained. You chose substance over pretty words. You chose partnership over promises. You chose me, and I will spend the rest of my life grateful for that choice. Happy anniversary, my love. 20 years down, forever to go. Elise closed the book with tears in her eyes and looked at her husband. Older now, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines etched around his eyes from years of squinting at the sun. But he was still the man who had found her on a platform, who had wrapped her frozen feet, who had offered her possibility when everyone else had offered pity. "I love you," she said simply. Then, now, always. Then, now, always, he echoed and kissed her with all the certainty of 2 decades spent building a life worth living. Their children grew and eventually left. Hannah to marry a neighboring rancher's son, Sawyer to start his own spread with Colt's help, Grace to study agriculture at a college back east with the intention of returning to modernize the family ranch. Each departure was bittersweet, but Elise took pride in knowing they'd raised children who were confident enough to build their own lives while knowing they always had a home to return to. As Elise and Colt entered their 60s, they spent more time on the porch, watching sunsets and remembering the years that had brought them here. The ranch was smaller now, managed by hired help with Colt, overseeing rather than doing the heavy work himself. Elise no longer taught at all, but former students still visited, bringing their own children to meet the woman who had taught their parents. One autumn evening, as they sat on that same porch where Elise had first arrived, scared and broken, Colt took her hand. "Do you remember what I told you that first night? In the lined shack? You told me a lot of things that night. I told you that a man's absence doesn't decide your worth. Do you still believe that?" Elise squeezed his hand. "I believe it more now than I did then. Because you didn't just tell me, you showed me. Every day for 40 years you've shown me that my worth comes from who I am, not who chooses me. Though I'm glad I chose you and you chose me back. Best decision I ever made. Well, second best. What was the first? Getting in your wagon that day at the station. Everything else grew from that one choice." They sat in comfortable silence as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the house behind them, Mrs. Chen was humming as she prepared tea. In the distance, cattle lowed softly. The land spread out before them, vast and enduring, marked by years of their labor and love. Elise thought about the girl who had stood on a train platform 40 years ago, watching her planned future disappear into the cold Dakota wind. That girl couldn't have imagined this life. The children, the grandchildren who visited during summer, the ranch that had become legendary in the territory, the love that had only deepened with time. If she could go back and tell that frightened, heartbroken girl what the future held, would she? Would she want to spare her the fear, the uncertainty, the terror of starting over with nothing but a stranger's kindness to guide her? No, Elise realized. Because that fear, that uncertainty, that terror, they had forged her into someone stronger than she ever would have been in the safe, predictable life she'd planned. They had cracked her open and let in light she hadn't known existed. "What are you thinking about?" Colt asked. "About how grateful I am that Thomas Hale left me standing on that platform." Colt laughed, the sound rich and warm in the gathering darkness. "That's the most romantic thing you've ever said to me." "It's true, though. If he'd shown up, I would have married him and spent my whole life not knowing what I was missing, not knowing you, not knowing what it feels like to build something real with someone who sees you clearly and loves you anyway. I'm glad he left you standing there too. Selfish of me, but true." They sat together as night fell completely, two people who had chosen each other across a blizzard and never stopped choosing each other through all the years that followed. The life Elise had planned was long gone, disappeared like snow in spring. But the life she'd built, messy and imperfect and absolutely real, was everything she'd never known she wanted. And as Colt's hand found hers in the darkness, warm and familiar and forever steady, Elise understood the final truth of her story. She hadn't been left at that platform. She'd been set free, free to discover her own strength, free to choose her own path, free to build a life that was wholly, completely, beautifully hers. The platform had been the ending of one story, yes, But more importantly, it had been the beginning of this one. A story of resilience and love and two people who found each other in a snowstorm and built a life that mattered. Not because it was easy, but because it was real. Not because it was planned, but because it was chosen. And in the end, that made all the difference.